I am Emma, 30 years old, and my family always thought I was the pathetic single mother working a dead-end tech job. At our family barbecue, my 7-year-old son simply asked for a burger. My sister snatched the plate away and sneered that premium meat was only for kids with an actual future. My parents laughed. I did not scream or argue. I just took my son by the hand and walked out. What they did not know was that the massive commercial contract my arrogant brother-in-law was depending on to save his fraudulent empire was sitting on my desk, waiting for my approval. At 11 that night, my phone exploded with their panic. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on the sprawling suburban estate my sister Brittany and her husband Jamal had rented for the summer. It was a massive modern farmhouse with an infinity pool designed to project an image of limitless wealth. I parked my sedan at the end of the long driveway, staying away from the luxury vehicles. I unbuckled my 7-year-old son Leo from his car seat. Leo has mild autism and ADHD, so new environments with loud noises always required preparation. I crouched down to his eye level, adjusting his noise-canceling headphones and reminding him we could leave whenever he felt overwhelmed. He gave me a brave nod and slipped his hand into mine. We walked toward the backyard where the party was in full swing. The smell of expensive grilled meat hit us immediately. Brittany was holding court by the outdoor kitchen wearing a silk sundress that likely cost more than my supposed monthly salary. She spotted us, and her practiced smile faltered before she waved us over. She made us walk through the crowd of affluent neighbors. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain jeans, and let out a breath dripping with condescension. "Emma, you made it," Brittany announced loudly enough for people nearby to stare. "I was worried your old car might have broken down again. We could have sent a driver for you and the boy. You know we do not mind helping out our less fortunate family members." I forced a polite smile, keeping my grip on Leo's hand steady. "My car runs fine, Brittany, but thank you for the generous offer." Just then Jamal stepped out onto the stone patio. Jamal is my brother-in-law, an African-American commercial real estate developer who carried himself like he owned the city. He wore a custom linen shirt and a gold watch that caught the sunlight. My parents, Richard and Cynthia, were trailing right behind him, hanging on to his every word. Jamal was loudly bragging about a massive new commercial lease, and my parents looked at him with the absolute adoration they never showed me. Jamal spotted us and walked over, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Emma." "Good to see you," he said, projecting his booming voice. Still plugging away at that tedious database job. "You know, if you ever want to transition out of the IT basement, my real estate company is always looking for administrative help. We have great basic benefits for single moms." My mother, Cynthia, chimed in, adjusting her heavy gold necklace. "You really should listen to Jamal, Emma. He is doing incredibly well. It is time you started thinking about Leo's future, instead of just scraping by doing tech support. You cannot rely on fixing broken computers forever." They thought I was a low-level server technician patching bugs for an hourly wage. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Corp, a data security corporation valued in the tens of millions. I had built my empire entirely under the radar, choosing extreme privacy over flashy displays of wealth to protect Leo and myself from this exact kind of toxic family dynamic. "I am doing just fine with my work, Mom," I replied evenly. My father, Richard, scoffed, taking a sip of his bourbon. "Fine is not successful, Emma. Look at your sister. Look at the incredible life Jamal provides for her. That is what real success looks like. You need to stop being so stubborn and let your successful family guide your poor choices." Leo tugged on my hand, shifting uncomfortably as the loud music and booming voices began to overwhelm his senses. I gently rubbed his back, trying to soothe his anxiety. He pointed toward the massive grill. Leo had been looking forward to a barbecue burger all week. It was one of his safe foods, and he had been practicing how to ask for it politely for days. He stepped forward slightly, slipping off one side of his headphones. "Can I have a burger, please?" Leo asked, his voice quiet and hesitant. Brittany immediately stepped between Leo and the grill. She picked up a pair of metal tongs and let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, sweetie, these are premium Wagyu beef burgers imported specially for Jamal's wealthy business clients and our important guests. We have some regular discount hot dogs inside the house for the kids." Leo looked confused, his eyes darting between the grill and Brittany. "But I really like burgers," he mumbled, taking another small step forward, trying to understand why he was not allowed to have the food right in front of him. Jamal laughed loudly from the sidelines, patting the head of his own perfectly dressed son, who was eating whatever he wanted. That is when Brittany snatched the platter of freshly grilled meat away from the counter and looked down at my innocent son with an expression of pure contempt. "Those are only for kids with a future," Brittany stated. Her voice carried a razor-sharp clarity that cut through the humid summer air. She did not break eye contact with me, wielding the insult like a finely sharpened blade. The ceramic platter of premium Wagyu beef hovered out of reach as Brittany stared down at my 7-year-old son. Her lips curled into a practiced sneer. The ambient noise of the upscale barbecue seemed to evaporate, leaving only the sizzle of the outdoor grill and the soft breathing of the watching guests. Leo stood there, his small hand suspended in mid-air, his noise-canceling headphones slightly askew. His brilliant mind processed information differently, and sarcasm often eluded him, but the sheer hostility radiating from his aunt was universally understood. He took a hesitant step backward, looking up at me for guidance. His confusion was a physical weight on my chest. I expected someone in my family to intervene. Instead, a booming laugh erupted from the patio lounge chairs. Jamal threw his head back, gripping his crystal tumbler of scotch. He found the cruel humiliation of a neurodivergent child genuinely hilarious. He reached over and ruffled the hair of his own perfectly styled 10-year-old son Malik, who was already eating a massive burger. "You have to admit, Emma, she has a point." Jamal chuckled, flashing his brilliant white teeth. "In this economy, you have to invest resources where you get a solid return. Right, Malik? My boy here is heading straight to an Ivy League prep school. We have to feed the brain trust." Jamal raised his glass toward Brittany in a mock salute. He wore his wealth-like armor, completely unaware that the foundation of his commercial real estate empire was currently being scrutinized by my security algorithms. I turned my gaze to my mother, expecting a shred of maternal decency. Cynthia stepped forward, adjusting her silk scarf. Her eyes held no sympathy for her grandson. She looked entirely embarrassed by our presence. "Emma, please," Cynthia hissed, keeping her voice low. "Do not make a scene in front of Jamal's important business associates. You know better than to let Leo wander around demanding things. Teach your son his place. If you cannot afford to feed him expensive food at your own home, do not expect us to foot the bill here. Take him inside and stop embarrassing your sister." My father, Richard, stood silent by the outdoor bar. He turned his back to us, pretending to examine a bottle of imported wine. His silence was the loudest endorsement of their cruelty. A sudden stillness settled over my mind. For 30 years I had endured their passive-aggressive comments, their blatant favoritism, and their constant need to diminish my existence. I had played the role of the struggling single mother because it kept Leo and me safely out of their toxic crosshairs. I had allowed them to believe I was a failure because their arrogance blinded them to the reality of my success. But attacking my innocent son for something he could not control was the absolute final boundary. The scared younger sister they thought they knew vanished in that exact second. In her place stood the chief executive officer of Apex Corp, a woman who routinely dismantled hostile corporate takeovers and managed classified data security for global institutions. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or launch into a defensive argument. An argument would mean I valued their opinion. I slowly lowered myself to one knee until I was perfectly eye level with Leo. I reached up and gently adjusted his noise-canceling headphones, making sure they were sitting comfortably. I smoothed his collar and offered him a steady smile. "It is okay, buddy," I said softly, ensuring my tone conveyed absolute safety and control. We are going to get something much better. I stood up and grasped his small hand securely in mine. I did not look at Brittany, Jamal, or my parents. They ceased to exist as anything more than collateral damage in a corporate file. The utter silence of my reaction deeply unnerved the surrounding guests. They had anticipated a breakdown, a tearful exit, or a screaming match. They were waiting for the pathetic, struggling sister to cause a scene they could gossip about later. Instead, I projected an aura of icy, terrifying calm. Every movement was precise and unbothered. I turned my back on the lavish outdoor kitchen and began walking toward the front gate. The heavy silence that followed us was deafening. No one spoke. The clinking of glasses completely ceased. The absolute finality of my departure hung in the humid air like a storm cloud about to burst. "That is right, just run away," Brittany called out after a moment, her voice carrying a slight edge of nervous hesitation. "Go back to your cramped little apartment, Emma. Thanks for ruining the mood." I did not pause my stride. I did not look back over my shoulder. We walked straight down the manicured stone pathway and out through the heavy wrought iron gates. The oppressive heat of their judgment faded the moment we reached my car. I opened the passenger door and helped Leo into his booster seat, buckling him in with careful attention. "Are we going to get the good burgers now, Mom?" Leo asked, looking up at me with his wide, innocent eyes. "We are going to get the best burgers in the entire city," I promised him, kissing his forehead. I closed his door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the wheel. As I started the engine, I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was early evening. The family was likely returning to their drinks and their laughter, congratulating themselves on successfully putting me in my place. They were blissfully celebrating Jamal's impending commercial real estate deal, entirely unaware of the catastrophic financial avalanche currently hurtling toward them. I pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving the massive rental mansion far behind in the rearview mirror. I drove toward the city center where the towering glass skyscrapers reflected the fading sunlight. My mind was completely clear, devoid of any lingering familial guilt. They had made their choice at the barbecue grill. Now they would have to live with the consequences of mine. The evening stretched ahead of us, peaceful and uninterrupted, but I knew exactly what was waiting in the shadows. In just a few hours, the automated security protocols at Apex Core would finalize the daily risk assessment reports. The illusion of Jamal's wealth would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The timer had officially started. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the smooth leather beneath my palms. The transition from discarded daughter to the architect of their ruin was complete. I simply had to wait for the clock to strike 11. The drive away from the sprawling suburban estate was like shedding a suffocating heavy layer of skin. I navigated my unassuming sedan through the winding neighborhood roads until the ostentatious mansions gave way to the sleek, towering glass architecture of the downtown financial district. Leo hummed a quiet, happy tune in the back seat, his anxiety visibly melting away with every mile we put between us and my toxic family. I kept the radio off and the air conditioning low, allowing the peaceful silence of the car to reset his overstimulated nervous system. We pulled up to the discreet valet entrance of Lumiere, a Michelin-starred culinary establishment known exclusively to the city elite for its unparalleled privacy and exquisite menu. The valet rushed forward, opening my door with a respectful bow. He did not bat an eye at the humble make of my car, because he knew exactly who owned it. He handed me my claim ticket with a polite "welcome back, madam," ensuring the transition from the vehicle to the restaurant was seamless. I guided Leo through the private side entrance and into the softly lit dining room. The contrast to Brittany's chaotic backyard barbecue was immediate and profound. Lumiere featured brilliant acoustic dampening architecture, thick velvet drapes, and widely spaced tables that swallowed ambient noise. It was a sensory haven designed for high-profile individuals who demanded absolute peace while they dined. But for us, it was simply the perfect environment for a neurodivergent child to enjoy a meal without fear of sensory overload. The maitre d' greeted us instantly, using my actual last name with deep respect. He led us past the main dining floor to a secluded corner booth enclosed by frosted glass partitions. Within moments, a waiter arrived, placing a crystal glass of sparkling water in front of me and a tall glass of freshly squeezed apple juice in front of Leo. "We would like the chef reserve Wagyu burger," I told the waiter, keeping my voice soft and reassuring. "No heavy sauces or complex garnishes, just the premium meat medium, well on a lightly toasted brioche bun. And a large side of the truffle fries, please." The waiter nodded, completely unfazed by a 7-year-old ordering a $100 item from the reserve menu. "An excellent choice, madam. I will have the executive chef prepare it immediately." Leo took off his noise-canceling headphones and placed them neatly on the plush leather seat beside him. The rigid tension had completely left his small shoulders. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a sketchbook and a box of specialized shading pencils, diving right into his favorite activity of drawing complex geometric cityscapes. I sat back and took a long sip of my water, letting the serene and highly controlled environment wash over me. I watched my beautiful son, realizing how close I had come to breaking my carefully constructed facade back at the barbecue. But anger was a useless, wasted emotion. Calculated action was my preferred currency. My phone vibrated silently against the smooth mahogany table. The screen displayed a secure encrypted connection. I glanced at Leo, who was fully absorbed in shading a perfect hexagonal skyscraper, and swiped to accept the call. "Good evening, Emma," the crisp professional voice of Marcus, my lead wealth manager, came through the private speaker. "I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I needed to confirm the final asset transfers for the quarter before the midnight deadline." "It is perfectly fine, Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice low so as not to disturb Leo. "Go ahead with the summary." "The quarterly dividends for Apex Core just cleared our internal auditing." He continued, the faint sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "The corporate data security division exceeded our most aggressive revenue models by a staggering 18%. We just secured 2 more federal contracts. We are looking at a net profit margin that places your personal liquid assets well over the 90 million mark. I have already diverted the standard blind trust allocations exactly as you prefer, keeping your name entirely off the public shareholder registry." "Perfect," I said, watching the waiter return to place a magnificent, perfectly seared gourmet burger in front of Leo. My son's eyes lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. Marcus paused for a brief moment. "Emma, I also reviewed the latest deployment projections for the new Educational Technology Initiative. The adaptive learning software designed specifically for neurodivergent students is ready for its global launch phase. The philanthropic arm of Apex Core is fully funded to deploy the technology to 300 public school districts across the country at zero cost to the institutions." "That is exactly what I wanted to hear." I smiled, watching Leo take a massive, eager bite of his premium meal. The entire reason I had founded Apex Core a decade ago was to generate the immense capital needed to fund that specific educational software. I wanted to build a world that accommodated brilliant, unconventional minds like Leo's, rather than forcing them to conform to rigid and outdated educational systems. "Excellent," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something slightly more personal. "Finally, I need your formal approval on the penthouse renovations. The luxury contractors want to finalize the installation of the sensory room on the upper floor of your residence. They are ready to import the specialized ambient lighting and tactile wall panels you requested from Sweden. The total cost will brush against $250,000. Approve the expense," I instructed without a second thought. "I want the entire top floor of the penthouse optimized for his absolute comfort before the new school year begins. Do whatever it takes to expedite the shipping." "Consider it done, Madam CEO," Marcus replied. "Have a peaceful evening." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my designer purse. My family fully believed I lived in a cramped rented apartment, struggling to make ends meet on a junior database administrator salary. They believed my modest car was a tragic symbol of my financial failure. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire top floor of the most exclusive residential tower in the downtown financial district. I drove a basic sedan because it allowed me to navigate the city entirely unnoticed. I wore plain clothing to their gatherings because I had absolutely nothing to prove to people I did not respect. I had spent the last 10 years building a corporate empire from the ground up, turning Apex Core into a ruthless titan of the tech industry. I kept my immense wealth a carefully guarded secret for one simple, highly calculated reason. I knew the exact nature of my family. I knew their insatiable greed, their toxic entitlement, and their vicious tendency to devour anyone who achieved more than they did. By playing the role of the struggling sister, I remained invisible. I protected my son from being used as a financial pawn in their endless pathetic games of social climbing. "Mom, this is the best burger ever," Leo mumbled happily, wiping a napkin across his mouth and breaking me out of my strategic thoughts. I smiled, reaching across the table to affectionately ruffle his hair. "I told you we would get something much better, buddy." We finished our exquisite meal in comfortable, relaxed silence. I paid the exorbitant bill with an exclusive black corporate card, leaving a massive tip for the staff who always treated my son with the utmost dignity. We walked out of the restaurant and drove the short distance to our actual home. The private security elevator shot us up 40 floors, depositing us directly into the grand foyer of our sprawling, glass-walled penthouse. The city lights sparkled far below us, a glittering sea of diamonds stretching to the dark horizon. I helped Leo get ready for bed, reading him 2 chapters of his favorite advanced science book until his breathing grew deep and steady. I tucked his heavy weighted blanket around his shoulders, kissed his forehead, and turned on his gentle star projector nightlight. I stepped out of his bedroom and walked quietly down the long hallway to my private home office. The room was dominated by a massive curved monitor setup displaying real-time data streams and global market fluctuations. I sat down in my leather executive chair and entered my multi-factor administrative credentials into the secure terminal. The screen illuminated, bathing the dark room in a cold, calculating blue light. I pulled up the specific financial dossier that my chief legal officer had flagged for my review earlier that week. It was the commercial lease contract for Jamal's real estate firm, the very contract he had been loudly bragging about at the barbecue. The contract that was supposed to save his heavily leveraged business from total collapse. I glanced down at the digital clock in the bottom right corner of my monitor. It read 10:45. The automated security sweep was scheduled to execute and lock the system in exactly 15 minutes. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms and staring at the glowing numbers. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, the calm before the inevitable storm. I waited for the clock to strike 11, knowing that the moment it did, the fake affluent world my family had so arrogantly built would begin to burn. The digital numbers on my secondary monitor shifted from 10:59 to 11:00. At that exact second, the automated risk assessment protocol initiated. Lines of encrypted code scrolled rapidly down my primary screen as Apex Core proprietary algorithms scrubbed through the daily financial submissions of our top-tier clients. I sat back in my leather executive chair and watched the progress bar hit 100%. A sharp, satisfying chime echoed from my desktop speakers. A bright red alert banner flashed across the minimalist interface. Subject: Jamal Davis, Commercial Real Estate Holdings. Status: contract terminated. Reason: critical fraud risk alert. Jamal had built his entire financial life on highly leveraged debt, moving money between shell companies and utilizing forged asset evaluations to secure massive loans. My company's software was designed specifically to catch this exact kind of predatory shell game for our banking clients. The multi-million-dollar commercial lease he had been loudly boasting about at the barbecue was now officially dead in the water. Without that massive infusion of capital, his creditors would realize he was insolvent, and they would start circling by morning. 5 minutes passed in absolute luxurious silence. I stood up, stretched my legs, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the glittering city skyline. Then my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the glass surface of my desk. It buzzed once, paused, and then erupted into a continuous violent spasm of activity. I picked up the device. The screen was flooded with notifications illuminating the dark room. There were 10 missed calls from Brittany, 15 urgent text messages from my mother Cynthia, 5 frantic voicemails from my father Richard. The messages were coming in so fast that the operating system momentarily lagged. I unlocked the screen and opened the family group chat. It was a chaotic mess of typos and panicked demands. Emma, answer your phone right now. Brittany had typed her capitalization showing her rising hysteria. Jamal just got a notification from his broker. His lease agreement was canceled. The system flagged him for fraud. My mother chimed in right below her. Emma, call your sister immediately. The automated rejection email came from a server at Apex Core. Is not that the IT company you do data entry for? My father followed up with a stern command. Pick up the phone, Emma. This is a family emergency. Jamal's entire business is on the line because of some stupid computer glitch at your office. I leaned against the heavy oak desk, sipping a glass of iced water. The profound irony of the situation washed over me. They truly believed I was a bottom-tier database administrator. They thought this was a simple routing error, a random technical glitch that a low-level employee could just manually override to save the day. They had absolutely no concept of the sophisticated financial tripwires Jamal had triggered, nor did they realize I was the architect who had designed those very tripwires. The phone screen lit up again with an incoming video call from Brittany. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I did not turn on my camera, leaving my side of the call completely black. The audio connected, bringing the frantic, chaotic sounds of Brittany rented mansion directly into my quiet executive office. They must have had me on speakerphone because I could hear all of them yelling at once. Jamal was pacing heavily in the background, cursing loudly and violently at someone on his own cell phone. Brittany sounded breathless. Her earlier arrogance completely vanished, replaced by sheer terror. Emma! Where have you been? Brittany practically shrieked into the microphone. Jamal! Massive deal just fell through. The broker said an independent auditing software flagged his accounts and issued a hard stop on the lease. The software belongs to Apex Core. I am aware of what Apex Core does, I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. My father snatched the phone from Brittany. I could hear the heavy rustle of the microphone being passed. Emma, listened to me very carefully, Richard barked, using the same authoritative tone he had used to terrorize me throughout my childhood. Jamal is about to lose a fortune because of a technical error at your workplace. We know you have access to the back-end servers. You are going to log into your work computer right now, find Jamal file, and delete that fraud alert. My mother's shrill voice echoed from a few feet away. Just bypass the security protocol, Emma. You are a tech person. You know how to erase a computer warning. Jamal's entire livelihood is resting on this deal. Do not be selfish. Fix the glitch immediately. The brazen entitlement was breathtaking. They had spent the entire afternoon mocking my son, humiliating me in front of strangers, and belittling my supposed low-income job. Now, just hours later, they were actively demanding I commit corporate espionage and risk federal prison to save the very man who had laughed at my child. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient tool, a disposable resource to be used and discarded at their convenience to protect their fake affluent lifestyle. Emma, are you listening to me? My father yelled, the panic in his voice escalating as Jamal smashed a glass against the patio stones in the background. Log into the Apex Core database right now and clear his name. I took another sip of my iced water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I stared out at the city lights, feeling the immense, unshakable power of my position. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or attempt to explain the intricate legalities of federal financial fraud. I simply let their panicked breathing fill the silence for a long, agonizing moment. I cannot do that, I said. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. The shock of my refusal temporarily short-circuited their collective brains. What do you mean you cannot do that? Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. You are just a database admin. Just type in your password and delete the file. Do you have any idea what will happen to us if this lease does not go through? We will lose everything, Emma. We will be ruined. I mean exactly what I said, I replied, my tone remaining entirely indifferent to her suffering. I cannot alter a verified fraud alert. Have a good night. before my father could launch into another tyrannical tirade or my mother could weaponize her maternal guilt. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I did not just hang up. I powered down the cell phone entirely, tossing it onto the leather sofa across the room. The silence returned to the penthouse, thick and deeply satisfying. I had drawn the absolute final boundary. The dominoes were officially in motion, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the collapse. I turned back to my glowing monitors, preparing a detailed dossier for my legal team. Tomorrow morning was going to be very interesting. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when the private intercom in my penthouse chimed. It was exactly 6:45. I was already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, sipping black coffee while reviewing the final legal briefs regarding Jamal's fraudulent accounts. The night before had been a symphony of panicked missed calls and unhinged voicemails from my relatives, but the silence of my secure top-floor residence had remained unbroken until now. I pressed the communication button on the sleek glass panel near the kitchen island. Madam C. E.O. The voice of Marcus. My head of building security came through the speaker with professional urgency. I apologize for the early intrusion. We currently have 4 individuals causing a significant disturbance in the main lobby. They are demanding access to the residential floors, claiming to be your immediate family. They do not have your apartment number and are insisting you rent a micro-unit on the lower levels. They are becoming increasingly hostile with the concierge staff. Should I have them escorted off the premises by local authorities? I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the familiar ice settle in my veins. My family had actually tracked down my building address, entirely oblivious to the fact that I owned the entire skyscraper and the luxury residential tower attached to it. They assumed I was merely a low-income tenant occupying a subsidized space in the shadow of true wealth. I glanced down the hall toward Leo's bedroom. My private nanny was already packing his specialized lunchbox for his nature-based educational program. Instruct the private driver to take Leo out through the subterranean secure garage, I told Marcus, keeping my voice remarkably steady. Do not let the individuals in the lobby see him depart. I will come down to the main floor and handle this personally. Have your security team stand by, but do not engage unless they become physically violent. I stepped into my private glass elevator and swiped my encrypted executive key card. The descent took 30 seconds, dropping me into the soaring, pristine white marble expanse of the building's grand lobby. The contrast between the serene architectural elegance and the chaotic screaming match happening near the front desk was jarring. Jamal looked entirely unraveled. The polished, arrogant real estate developer from the BBQ was gone. His custom linen shirt was deeply wrinkled, and dark sweat stains pooled beneath his arms. Brittany stood beside him, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, her face pale and her expensive makeup severely smudged from a sleepless night of crying. My parents Cynthia and Richard flanked them, looking furious and disheveled, completely abandoning their refined, high society personas. They spotted me the moment I stepped out of the private corridor. Brittany pointed a shaking finger in my direction, letting out a shrill, desperate sound. There she is, Brittany shrieked, marching across the polished marble floor. Tell these snobby rent-a-cops to let us up to your apartment right now, Emma. We have been waiting out here for 20 minutes and they refuse to even look up your unit number. Jamal shoved past his wife, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He invaded my personal space entirely too close, smelling of stale alcohol and pure panic. You are going to take us up to whatever tiny little shoebox you rent in this building right now. Jamal demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You are going to open your cheap little laptop, log into your remote work portal, and fix the absolute disaster you caused last night. I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact or acknowledge their physical intimidation. I did not cause a disaster, Jamal, I replied coldly. Apex Core simply flagged a massive web of shell companies and forged asset evaluations. I have absolutely nothing to fix. You brought this entirely upon yourself. My mother, Cynthia, pushed herself to the front of the group, her face contorted into an ugly mask of maternal disappointment. How dare you speak to him that way, she snapped, grabbing my forearm tightly. I firmly removed her hand from my sleeve, stepping back. Jamal is family Emma. He provides for your sister. He is a successful man dealing with a minor paperwork error, and you are being stubborn and vindictive because you are jealous of what they have built. You are going to march up to your little apartment and erase that alert before the banks open at 9 o'clock. The utter delusion was staggering. They still viewed me as the helpless, compliant scapegoat they could bully into submission. When I remained completely silent, offering them nothing but a glacial stare, my father Richard finally lost whatever shred of self-control he had left. Richard stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. He looked like a man ready to commit violence to protect his fraudulent empire. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," he growled, jabbing his finger mere inches from my face. "You owe this family. You owe us for putting a roof over your head and dealing with your endless difficulties. You think you can just walk away from us and let your sister's husband face financial ruin over some computer code. You owe us your absolute loyalty." "I owe you nothing," I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that seemed to freeze the air around us. "You never supported me. You never helped me when I was struggling to pay for my certifications. You left Leo and me to fend for ourselves while you showered Brittany with endless cash. Do not stand in my building and talk to me about loyalty or debt." Richard let out a harsh, vicious laugh that sounded like tearing metal. His eyes burned with a toxic, triumphant malice. "You want to talk about support?" he sneered, lowering his voice, so the security guards hovering nearby could not hear his confession. "You want to know why you never had any help starting out, Emma? Because we took it. We emptied your entire college savings account right before you graduated high school." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A cold shock radiated through my chest, but I kept my facial expression completely blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my pain. "That is right," Richard continued, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You thought the market crashed and wiped out your funds. We drained every single penny of your savings to pay for Brittany's destination wedding in Tuscany. Brittany was marrying a man with an actual future. She needed a flawless start in high society. She needed to look the part. You were just going to drop out of community college anyway. You were destined for mediocrity. We made a financial investment in the child who actually mattered." Cynthia nodded right beside him, showing absolutely zero remorse for stealing my future to fund a glorified party. "It was the practical choice, Emma," she added coldly. "You were always going to be a struggle. We did what we had to do for the family image." The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled over me, replacing any lingering familial connection with absolute hardened steel. They had actively robbed me, sabotaged my education, and forced me to work multiple grueling jobs while raising a neurodivergent child alone, all to buy expensive champagne and floral arrangements for Brittany. "So here is how you are going to repay your debt to us," Richard ordered, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "You are going to go into your office at that mediocre tech company right now. You are going to use whatever low-level backdoor access you have, and you are going to delete Jamal's fraud file. You are going to commit whatever corporate sabotage is necessary to clear his name. If you have to break the law to hack the system, you will do it. You will save this family today, Emma, or so help me. I will make sure you and that defective child of yours end up on the street." The echo of my father's threat hung in the pristine air of the grand lobby. Calling my son defective was the final rusted nail in the coffin of our relationship. A lethal, absolute calm washed over me. Marcus and his security detail took a synchronized step forward, their hands resting discreetly near their radios, ready to physically remove Richard from the premises. I raised a single, perfectly manicured finger, signaling them to hold their positions. I wanted my family to dig their graves entirely unassisted. Sensing that my father's violently aggressive approach had completely backfired, Jamal smoothly intervened. He adjusted the lapels of his wrinkled linen shirt and adopted a practiced, condescending tone. He pivoted effortlessly, transforming himself from a cornered, desperate fraudster into a persecuted victim. "Let us be real for a second, Emma," Jamal said, shaking his head with a manufactured sigh. "This is not about some random computer code. This is about you. You have been sitting on the sidelines for years, watching me build a massive commercial empire. You have been watching a successful black man rise to the very top of a ruthless real estate game designed to keep him out. You hate that I can give your sister the kind of lavish life you will never experience. You resent my wealth because you are stuck living paycheck to paycheck in this exact building, renting a tiny little box, while I close multi-million-dollar deals. He took a step closer, pitching his voice to sound deeply wounded and profoundly disappointed. You are using this corporate glitch to punish us because you are jealous. You are hiding behind a supposedly neutral algorithm because you cannot handle the fact that I won and you lost. Do not let your petty bitterness ruin my hard work. Be a bigger person, Emma. Fix the system bias, clear my name, and stop trying to drag me down to your level. His attempt to weaponize social struggles to cover up his blatant shell company fraud was genuinely repulsive. He wanted to frame his criminal financial manipulation as a triumphant underdog story. He wanted to make me the villain for refusing to be his accomplice. Before I could dismantle Jamal's pathetic victim narrative, my mother decided to deploy her own specialized weaponry. Cynthia suddenly covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud theatrical sob. The tears were summoned with terrifying speed. She stumbled forward, reaching out to grab my shoulder. I took a deliberate step back, allowing her grasping hands to catch nothing but empty air. "How can you be so incredibly cold?" Cynthia wailed, her voice echoing off the polished marble pillars. "I am your mother, Emma. I gave you life. I sacrificed everything to raise you, and this is how you repay my love. By standing there and watching us suffer. We are your family." She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue, looking at me as if I were a monster. "I know we made hard choices in the past, but we did what we had to do. You cannot hold a petty grudge over a college fund when your brother-in-law is facing total ruin. We reallocated those finances for the greater good of the family image. Please, Emma, I am begging you as a mother. Just log into your little computer and fix this one minor mistake. If you do not do this, you will break my heart into a million pieces. You will destroy this entire family." I stared at the three of them. A fraudster playing the martyr, a thief playing the devoted mother, a bully demanding submission. The clarity I felt in that exact moment was absolute and unbreakable. "You are entirely delusional," I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. "Jamal mathematics does not possess bias, and algorithms do not experience jealousy. You created dummy corporations, forged asset valuations, and attempted to secure massive federal funds with completely fraudulent collateral. You are not a victim of anything except your own profound arrogance. You built a highly illegal house of cards, and Apex Core simply turned on the fan." I turned my piercing gaze to Cynthia, watching her fake tears instantly evaporate under the weight of my scrutiny. "And do not dare speak to me about breaking this family." I continued, my tone devoid of a single ounce of warmth. "You just stood there and proudly admitted to stealing my future to pay for a wedding. You stood by in complete silence while the man you married called my innocent child defective. You do not want a daughter. You want a compliant servant you can exploit and manipulate whenever it suits your narrative." I squared my shoulders, projecting every inch of the ruthless corporate executive they had no idea they were dealing with. "I am not going to risk my position, my freedom, or my peace of mind to save you from the consequences of your own catastrophic greed," I declared, establishing a boundary forged in pure steel. "I will not log into any system. I will not erase a single file. My answer is absolutely no." The flat, undeniable finality of my refusal struck them like a physical blow. The color instantly drained from Brittany's face as the reality of their impending bankruptcy finally settled in. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He pointed his shaking finger at me one last time, his voice vibrating with rage. "You are dead to us!" Richard roared, his spit flying through the air. "Do you hear me? You are no longer my daughter. We are cutting you off completely. Do not ever call us. Do not ever ask us for a single dime. When you end up in the gutter, do not expect us to save you. We are completely disowning you," Brittany screamed, clutching Jamal's arm as if he were her last remaining possession. "You are toxic, Emma. You are a bitter, miserable failure, and you are going to die entirely alone." Security, I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through their hysterical screaming. These individuals are trespassing. Escort them off the property immediately. If they resist, call the police. Marcus stepped forward instantly, joined by three heavily muscled guards in dark, immaculate suits. The imposing wall of professional security personnel finally broke through my family's delusions of grandeur. They backed away toward the revolving glass doors, shouting obscenities and cursing my name. I watched them practically run out of the lobby, their desperate threats fading into the busy morning street traffic. They honestly believed they had just discarded a worthless relative. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on the architect of their absolute destruction. And how long do you think Jamal's creditors will wait before they start seizing his assets? And how long do you think Jamal's creditors will wait before they start seizing his assets? The answer, of course, was that they would not wait at all. Financial predators never do. I watched the revolving glass doors settle back into a slow, steady spin, reflecting the early morning sunlight. The venomous echoes of my father's disownment still hung in the grand lobby, but they felt entirely weightless. They had severed the final imaginary thread connecting us, freeing me to operate without a single shred of familial restraint. I turned to Marcus, who was already issuing silent commands into his earpiece to secure the perimeter. I needed to shift gears immediately. The protective mother who wore unassuming sweaters and kept her head down was no longer required today. I stepped back into the private elevator and pressed the biometric scanner for the subterranean executive garage. Down in the pristine concrete bunker, my personal driver was waiting beside a custom matte black armored SUV. I slid into the spacious, quiet back seat, pulling a crisp, tailored blazer over my shoulders and swapping my practical flats for a pair of formidable stiletto heels. The heavy reinforced doors closed with a solid thud, sealing me inside my mobile command center. The drive to the Apex Corps headquarters took exactly 12 minutes. Our corporate campus was a sprawling complex of dark glass and steel dominating the city tech corridor. As the SUV pulled into the secured underground executive bay, the heavy steel gate clamped shut behind us, isolating me from the bustling city outside. A dedicated private elevator whisked me upward, bypassing 90 floors of bustling data analysts, engineers, and cybersecurity experts directly to the absolute top. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the nerve center of my empire. The top-floor executive suite was a masterclass in minimalist intimidation. It featured stark charcoal walls, brushed steel accents, and panoramic floor-to-ceiling views of the entire metropolitan sprawl. I walked past the reception desk, where my senior executive assistant nodded crisply, handing me a fresh double espresso and a biometric tablet glowing with the morning security briefings. Every single employee on this floor moved with intense, focused precision. There was no hesitation and no wasted energy. Here I was not Emma, the struggling single mother, or the discarded disappointment of a toxic family. I was the architect. I was the apex predator they all answered to. I pushed open the heavy double doors to my private office. Waiting for me at the expansive obsidian conference table was David Sterling, my chief legal officer. David was a former federal prosecutor, a man whose mind operated like a lethal steel trap. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He knew exactly what had transpired the night before regarding the automated system flags, and he knew exactly why I was arriving with ice in my veins. "Good morning, Emma," David said, sliding a thick, physical dossier across the smooth black table. "The digital copies are locked down in our secure servers, but I wanted you to see the hard data with your own eyes." The automated fraud alert triggered on Jamal Davis was just the tip of the iceberg. Our deep dive financial scrub finished at 0600 hours, and the reality is staggering. I sat down at the head of the table, sipping the bitter espresso, and opened the heavy dossier. The pages were filled with complex flowcharts, tracking massive international wire transfers, offshore holding accounts, and shell corporations registered in various tax havens. It was not a simple case of a desperate real estate developer inflating his assets to secure a better interest rate on a commercial lease. This is a textbook Ponzi scheme, David explained, tapping a silver pen against a particularly dense graph, illustrating the illicit flow of capital. Jamal has been using the incoming investments from his newer projects to pay off the massive, staggering debts of his older, failing properties. He has not actually completed a successful commercial development in over 4 years. He is simply moving phantom money around to create the illusion of extreme liquidity. The lease contract our software canceled last night was his final desperate attempt to secure a massive federal grant to keep the entire house of cards from collapsing. I scanned the meticulously gathered documents, absorbing the sheer scale of his criminal incompetence. Jamal had built an empire of air and pure arrogance. He had routinely defrauded investors, lied to federal regulators, and falsified bank records on a spectacular level. The superiority he had displayed at the barbecue, bragging loudly about his extreme wealth while simultaneously mocking my neurodivergent son, was funded entirely by stolen, unrecoverable money. But it gets infinitely worse, Emma, David said, his tone shifting to something much darker and more serious. He leaned forward, flipping to the final section of the thick file. In order to secure the initial collateral for these highly illegal loans, Jamal needed clean assets. He needed assets with absolutely no existing liens and perfect credit history. He could not use his own properties because they were already leveraged to the absolute breaking point. I looked down at the highlighted financial disclosures and my blood ran ice cold. Printed in stark black and white on the official bank guarantor forms were the names of my parents, Richard and Cynthia. Jamal convinced your father to grant him full power of attorney over their entire estate. David continued, his voice clinical and precise. Your brother-in-law used that unfettered access to secretly leverage your parents' entire investment portfolio. He took out massive secondary mortgages on their suburban mansion. He liquidated their retirement accounts and used the cash to prop up his failing shell companies. Your parents are the primary guarantors on over $20 million of completely fraudulent debt. I stared silently at the signatures on the bottom of the loan agreements. Richard and Cynthia had willingly signed over their entire life savings to the golden son-in-law they worshipped blindly. The very same people who had stood in my lobby an hour ago, proudly confessing that they had deliberately stolen my college fund to pay for Brittany's extravagant wedding, had just lost absolutely everything they owned to the man she married. They were entirely oblivious. Right at this exact moment, they were likely sitting in Jamal rented mansion comforting Brittany and raging endlessly about my lack of loyalty. They thought their biggest problem was a canceled commercial lease caused by a stubborn daughter. They had absolutely no idea that when the federal authorities inevitably raided Jamal corporate offices, they would also be immediately seizing my parents' home, their bank accounts, and their entire retirement fund to pay back the defrauded investors. Are they legally protected in any capacity? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous murmur echoing in the large office. David shook his head firmly. Not a chance. They signed the guarantor paperwork willingly and legally. The digital paper trail shows they formally authorized every single transfer. When Jamal goes down for federal fraud, they go down right alongside him. They will be entirely destitute by the end of the fiscal quarter. I closed the heavy dossier, resting my hands flat on top of it. The profound poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming to process. They had demanded I commit corporate sabotage to save their beloved Jamal. They had violently disowned me for refusing to break the law. They had thrown me away like garbage to protect a man who had actively, secretly, and ruthlessly robbed them blind. Prepare the complete data package for the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission, I commanded, standing up and staring out the window at the sprawling city below. Do not redact a single line. Send everything we have on Jamal directly to the authorities. Let his creditors know his assets are entirely fictitious. David nodded, gathering the files with swift efficiency. It will trigger an immediate federal investigation, Emma. They will likely arrest him before the week is over. I turned back to face my chief legal officer, my expression an impenetrable mask of pure corporate power. That is exactly what I am counting on. The time for warnings has passed. Let the avalanche begin. The avalanche had been triggered, but federal investigations operate with a silent, grinding efficiency. For 72 hours, the world remained blissfully unaware of the catastrophic financial implosion accelerating toward Jamal and my parents. I spent those 3 days operating at peak capacity, overseeing the global expansion of Apex Core, while ensuring Leo enjoyed his nature programs and quiet evenings in our penthouse. I was content to let the regulatory agencies perform their surgical dismantling of Jamal's fraudulent empire without any further intervention from me. Then the digital alert shattered the quiet of a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly earnings report when my private office door swung open. It was not David Sterling this time, but Elena Rostova, my director of digital intelligence. Elena rarely left the subterranean cybersecurity floor unless a level 5 breach was currently underway. She did not bother sitting down. She simply walked straight to my desk and placed a locked tablet on the glass surface. We intercepted a massive coordinated social media spike originating from your sister's verified accounts. Elena stated, her voice tight with professional outrage. It is currently gaining aggressive traction across multiple platforms. We have an army of attorneys ready to issue immediate cease and desist orders, and our algorithmic scrubbers can wipe this entirely from the internet within 10 minutes. I just need your authorization. I swiped my thumb across the biometric sensor to unlock the screen. Nothing could have prepared me for the sheer depravity of what Brittany had unleashed. My sister had produced a highly edited, emotionally manipulative video sitting in her lavishly decorated living room. She wore minimal makeup and an oversized sweater, perfectly curating the aesthetic of a deeply traumatized, concerned aunt. The video was titled "The Truth About My Toxic Sister and Saving Leo." I watched the screen as Brittany stared directly into the camera, manufacturing fresh tears with terrifying skill. She spoke in a trembling whisper, claiming that she could no longer remain silent while her innocent nephew suffered. She systematically painted me as an unhinged, abusive monster who had isolated herself from a loving family out of pure spite. But the character assassination directed at me was entirely secondary to the horrific, fabricated narrative she spun about my son. Brittany claimed that Leo's neurodivergence was a complete lie. She told her thousands of followers that his sensory processing differences and communication challenges were actually the direct result of severe maternal neglect. She detailed entirely fictional accounts of me locking him in dark closets for days, refusing to feed him properly, and denying him basic medical care. She claimed that my parents had bankrupted themselves, trying to pay for secret interventions to save him from my abuse. She painted Jamal as a heroic figure who had tried to intervene only to be targeted by my vindictive jealousy. At the bottom of the video, she had linked a crowdfunding campaign. She was actively soliciting donations from strangers under the guise of funding a legal battle to petition the courts for emergency custody of Leo. The video had already amassed 500,000 views. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of strangers demanding my arrest, sending death threats, and praising Brittany for her incredible bravery. My vision tunneled. The ambient hum of the city outside my window vanished entirely. A cold, localized pressure built right behind my eyes. Up until this exact second, I had viewed my family as a pathetic nuisance. Their greed and their entitlement were predictable flaws that I could simply outmaneuver and observe from a safe distance. I had been willing to let them suffer the natural, inevitable consequences of their own staggering financial incompetence. But Brittany had deliberately weaponized my child. She had commodified his privacy and fabricated a narrative of horrific abuse to feed her own vindictive ego and potentially scam innocent people out of their money. She had crossed the ultimate absolute boundary. Elena stood perfectly still, waiting for my command. "Shall I execute the scrub protocol?" Elena asked softly, sensing the lethal shift in the atmosphere of the room. "We can have her accounts permanently suspended for violating terms of service regarding targeted harassment and fraudulent fundraising." I kept my eyes locked on the paused image of my sister's weeping face. The cold indifference that had armored me for years completely dissolved, replaced by a blinding, active fury. If I simply deleted the video, Brittany would spin it as a corporate conspiracy. She would claim I used my tech connections to silence her truth. She would retreat into her manufactured victimhood and continue to wage a guerrilla war against my family. "No," I said, my voice sounding like cracking ice. "Do not take it down. Do not scrub a single comment. I want you to archive everything. Mirror the entire campaign onto our secure offline servers. Capture every donation she receives through that fraudulent link. Document every IP address, every share, and every defamatory claim she makes." Elena blinked in surprise. "Madam CEO, she is actively soliciting funds based on criminal defamation. If we let this run, it will do significant damage to your personal reputation." "My reputation is bulletproof," I countered, standing up and handing the tablet back to her. "Let her speak. Let her build an audience. Let her gather hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent donations. She is publicly documenting her own wire fraud and criminal defamation in real time. We are going to let her dig this hole so incredibly deep that she will never see sunlight again." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the crawling traffic. My family wanted a war. They wanted to drag me through the mud to make themselves look like martyrs. They believed they were hunting a vulnerable, isolated single mother. They had no idea they had just stepped into the cage with an apex predator. I needed to adjust the timeline. Letting the federal agents quietly arrest Jamal in his office was no longer sufficient. My parents and my sister needed to be exposed under the brightest, most unforgiving lights possible. They needed to experience the exact same public humiliation and total devastation they were currently trying to inflict upon me and my innocent son. "Call David Sterling back up here," I instructed Elena, not turning away from the window. "Tell him to hold the initial federal data dump. We are going to orchestrate a much larger stage. I want every single one of them gathered in the same room when the hammer falls. I want Brittany to explain her heroic rescue mission to the federal agents while they place her husband in handcuffs." Elena nodded, a sharp, predatory smile touching her lips. "Consider it done. We will monitor the smear campaign around the clock." As the door closed behind her, I pulled out my secure mobile device. I had one more piece to maneuver into place. I needed a venue, a reason for my entire treacherous family to assemble and celebrate their supposed victory over me. They thrived on high society events and public validation. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would give them a masterpiece of mutual destruction. It took exactly 48 hours for the first undeniable tremor of Jamal's financial earthquake to shatter my parents' immaculate reality. While I was finalizing the digital evidence packages for the federal authorities, David Sterling sent me a priority encrypted alert. The secondary lenders had officially initiated auto-seizure protocols. Richard and Cynthia had been enjoying their morning coffee when the certified bank courier arrived. Their sprawling suburban estate, their pristine investment portfolios, and everything they had secretly leveraged to fund Jamal's phantom empire were now officially in pre-foreclosure. The panic must have been absolute and entirely suffocating. The flawless high society facade they had spent decades cultivating was suddenly cracking violently at the foundation. Yet in their twisted, impenetrable delusion, they still did not blame the man who had forged their signatures and drained their accounts. They blamed the software algorithm that caught him. They blamed me. By Thursday afternoon, my personal phone illuminated with a message from my mother. It was a masterclass in calculated emotional manipulation. She completely ignored the vicious confrontation in my lobby. She completely ignored Brittany's ongoing criminal smear campaign against my child. Instead, her text was dripping with saccharine, desperate concern. "Emma darling," the message read, "the hostility the other day was a terrible misunderstanding. We are a family, and family must heal. Your father and I have reserved the private dining room at Le Sommet for tonight at 8. Jamal and Brittany will be there. We want to apologize and find a path forward together. Please come." Le Sommet was the city's most exclusive dining establishment, a place where the elite went to be seen conducting business over plates of white truffle risotto and $1,000 bottles of Bordeaux. It was the perfect stage for an ambush. They assumed that in a highly public, incredibly affluent setting, I would be intimidated into compliance. They believed they could use the sheer weight of social pressure and public decorum to force me to unlock Apex Core and erase Jamal's debt before the bank seized their home. I smiled reading the message. They had unwittingly constructed the exact arena I needed for their absolute destruction. I typed a simple response: I will be there. I arrived at Le Sommet precisely at 8 o'clock. The restaurant was a cathedral of modern luxury featuring soaring, vaulted ceilings, cascading crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with rare illuminated vintages. The ambient noise was a wealthy hum of hushed conversations and the clinking of heavy silver on fine china. The maitre d' recognized my face instantly, not because of my parents' reservation, but because Apex Core owned the primary holding company that managed the entire restaurant group. I was given a discreet deferential nod and escorted directly to the raised private alcove overlooking the main dining floor. My family was already seated around a massive circular table draped in heavy white linen. The contrast between their projected image and their actual reality was glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention. Richard was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, but his usual commanding posture was rigidly tense. A visible sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead, and his knuckles were stark white as he gripped his crystal water glass. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff pretending he could fly. Cynthia wore a heavy diamond necklace that was likely slated to be repossessed by the end of the week. She was smiling far too widely, her eyes darting nervously around the room, ensuring the other wealthy patrons were observing their apparent family unity. She was desperately performing for an audience that did not care. Jamal sat next to Brittany, projecting aggressive arrogance to mask his sheer terror. He kept checking his platinum watch, his leg bouncing incessantly under the table, vibrating the fine crystal. He knew federal regulators were closing in, even if he did not yet know I was the one holding the leash. And Brittany, my sister, wore a designer silk dress, holding a flute of vintage champagne with practiced elegance. Just hours ago, she had been weeping on camera about my supposed abuse, begging strangers for donations to save my child. Now she was sipping expensive wine, looking entirely unbothered by the fictional trauma she was aggressively selling to the internet. I stepped into the alcove projecting absolute, unshakable calm. I wore a tailored midnight blue blazer over a simple silk blouse, carrying a slim black leather portfolio containing the final nail for their collective coffins. "Emma," my mother gasped, rising half out of her chair with a manufactured expression of maternal joy. "You came. I knew you would not turn your back on your own flesh and blood. Please sit down, sweetheart. We have already ordered the tasting menu." I took the remaining seat directly across from my father. I did not return her smile. I placed my leather portfolio flat on the table and folded my hands over it, resting in perfect stillness. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. He tried to summon the booming, authoritative voice he had used to terrorize me during my childhood, but it wavered slightly at the edges, betrayed by his underlying panic. "Emma, I am glad you decided to be reasonable." He began, offering a tight, strained smile. "We all said things we regret the other day. Emotions were running high, but we are here tonight to put all of that behind us. We are here to act like adults and fix this unfortunate misunderstanding with Jamal's accounts so we can all move forward." I stared at him, maintaining agonizing, unbroken eye contact. "It is truly fascinating that you call impending federal indictment and the total foreclosure of your estate a simple misunderstanding, Richard." The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. Cynthia let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hand flying to her diamond necklace. Jamal's bouncing legs suddenly stopped dead. They realized instantly that I knew exactly how deep the rot went. But their arrogance was a terminal disease. Instead of retreating, they prepared to double down, entirely oblivious to the trap closing around them. Jamal stared at me for a long, agonizing moment before his meticulously constructed mask of righteous indignation shattered completely. The polished, sophisticated real estate mogul vanished, revealing the cornered, desperate street hustler underneath. He let out a sharp breath that sounded like a hiss and reached inside the breast pocket of his wrinkled designer jacket. He withdrew a thick sheaf of legal-sized paper stapled neatly at the top corner. He threw it onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy document landed with a dull thud, sliding past the crystal water pitchers until it rested directly in front of my hands. "Read it," Jamal ordered, his voice dropping to a frantic, venomous whisper designed to stay hidden beneath the ambient noise of the upscale dining room. I did not reach for the papers immediately. I simply lowered my gaze, studying the bold, stark font at the top of the page. It was an affidavit, a formal sworn legal declaration drafted by a highly expensive law firm. I slowly extended my hand, picking up the document and flipping through the thick premium paper. The sheer audacity of the fabricated narrative printed on those pages was almost breathtaking. The document was a full, legally binding confession. It stated in excruciating detail that I, Emma, had purposefully and maliciously infiltrated the back-end systems of Apex Core. It claimed I had manually altered algorithms and injected false data into the federal risk assessment software specifically to target Jamal out of a deep-seated personal vendetta. The affidavit painted me as a deeply unstable, bitter woman who had illegally utilized corporate technology to sabotage a highly successful Black entrepreneur because I was consumed by jealousy over my sister's luxurious lifestyle. It included a clause stating that my actions were entirely rogue, unsanctioned by Apex Core leadership, and highly illegal. I looked up from the pages, my expression entirely unreadable. You actually paid an attorney to draft this utter fiction. It is your only way out, Emma. Jamal sneered, leaning across the table and invading my personal space. The scent of stale alcohol and pure panic radiated from him. You sign that paper right now. You admit that you altered the code to frame me. Once you sign, my legal team will immediately file a massive defamation and corporate sabotage lawsuit against your tech company. We will file a federal injunction that will freeze all asset seizures and halt the regulator investigation until the lawsuit is settled. He tapped a shaking finger against the signature line at the bottom of the final page. It is brilliant. Your company will settle out of court to avoid the massive public scandal of an employee going rogue. I will use the settlement money to pay off the immediate creditors. The feds will drop the investigation because the initial alert was proven to be maliciously manufactured. I save my empire and the bank does not take your parents' house. Everybody wins. I sat back in my plush velvet chair, allowing the absolute insanity of his master plan to wash over me. He wanted me to sign a fake confession admitting to federal cybercrimes. He wanted me to hand him the ammunition to sue my own company, the very company I secretly owned and operated. He believed he could force a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate into a panicked settlement based on the fabricated confession of a mid-level employee. My father slammed his hand against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. He leaned forward, his face a mask of desperate entitlement. You are going to sign that document, Emma Richard commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. You owe us. You have caused an absolute catastrophe with your petty jealousy. You triggered an alert that is threatening to ruin this entire family. This is your one chance to make things right. You are going to take responsibility for your vindictive actions and save this family from financial ruin. Cynthia nodded vigorously beside him, her diamond necklace sparkling under the dining room chandeliers. Listen to your father, Emma, she pleaded, deploying her weaponized maternal guilt. If you sign this, we can stop the banks. We can save the estate. We can go back to being a normal, happy family. We will even forgive you for being so stubborn and difficult. Just put your name on the line and fix this mess. You owe us for everything we did for you. Brittany swirled her champagne, letting out a short, cruel laugh. And if you sign it, I will take down the video about Leo, she added, a nasty, triumphant gleam in her eyes. I will tell my followers that I was just emotional and exaggerated the situation. I will delete the crowdfunding link, but if you refuse, I will go on national television tomorrow morning and tell the entire world what a monster you are. I will make sure social services takes that child away from you forever. They sat there, a unified front of absolute delusion. They had stolen from me, abused me, neglected my child, and now they were demanding I throw myself into a literal fire to save them from a man who had secretly bankrupted them. They were offering me the grand privilege of going to federal prison so they could keep attending country club dinners. The silence stretched across the table, heavy and suffocating. They watched me eagerly, mistaking my stillness for submission. They thought their combined pressure had finally broken my spirit. They thought the threat of public humiliation and the loss of my son had cornered me into compliance. I looked down at the fabricated confession. I looked at Richard's flushed, desperate face. I looked at Cynthia's grasping hands. I looked at Brittany's petty, cruel smirk. And finally, I looked at Jamal, watching his facade crumble as my silence stretched a second too long. I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not waste a single breath trying to defend my son, my career, or my sanity to people who were fundamentally incapable of comprehending the truth. The time for words had officially ended. I smiled. It was not a warm smile or a frightened smile. It was a glacial, terrifying expression that failed to reach my eyes. It was the smile of an executioner watching the blade fall. The triumphant expressions on their faces instantly faltered. The cold, absolute certainty radiating from my posture unsettled the air around the table. I reached into my designer leather purse. I bypassed my phone, my encrypted security keys, and my corporate access cards. My fingers brushed against the small leather wallet tucked in the side pocket. I slowly withdrew a single crisp $20 bill. I placed the green currency gently onto the pristine white tablecloth, resting it directly next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. I smoothed the edges of the bill with deliberate, careful precision. Then, without uttering a single syllable, I stood up from the table. Emma Richard barked, his voice cracking with sudden, raw panic. "Sit down right now. We are not finished here. Where do you think you are going?" I picked up my slim black portfolio and adjusted the lapels of my blazer. I did not look back at them. I turned on my stiletto heels and walked away from the alcove, my footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors of the restaurant. Behind me, I could hear the immediate frantic eruption of chaos. I heard Jamal cursing loudly. I heard my mother gasp in horror. I heard the sharp scraping of a chair as someone tried to stand up. I did not stop. I walked past the maitre d', who bowed his head respectfully. I walked out the heavy glass doors and into the cool evening air of the city, leaving my family trapped in the luxurious cage they had built for themselves, completely consumed by the sudden terrifying realization that no one was coming to save them. The crisp night air of the city hit my face like a cleansing breath. I did not look back at the illuminated windows of Le Sommet, where my family was undoubtedly tearing each other apart in the wake of my departure. I simply stepped into the back of my waiting town car and instructed my driver to take me home to Leo. The trap had been baited and sprung. All that remained was waiting for the final agonizing contraction of the snare. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, the federal agencies executing the investigation ceased operating in the shadows. The silent monitoring phase ended, and the active seizure protocol commenced with ruthless digital efficiency. I was seated at the massive polished obsidian desk in my executive suite at Apex Core, nursing a cup of black coffee, while Elena Rostova stood beside me monitoring the live data feeds. We watched the financial obliteration of Jamal's empire unfold in real time. It was a masterpiece of coordinated regulatory action. Within a span of 45 seconds, every single corporate bank account, offshore holding company, and shell corporation tied to his name was completely frozen. The federal hold bypassed standard banking procedures, locking the assets at the institutional level. The collateral damage was instantaneous. The heavily leveraged secondary lines of credit that Richard and Cynthia had signed over to fund Jamal's phantom developments were simultaneously zeroed out. The banks immediately flagged their primary estate for aggressive asset recovery. Through Elena's comprehensive cybersecurity net, we tracked the precise moments the reality of their situation collided with their insurmountable arrogance. Jamal's platinum corporate credit card was declined while attempting to pay for a private car service. 20 minutes later, his personal accounts flashed insufficient funds. By 9 o'clock, his frantic calls to his defense attorneys were being summarily rejected because his retainers were bouncing. The resulting meltdown was spectacular. According to the intercepted communication logs pouring into Elena's encrypted tablet, the family immediately converged on my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The property was already in the early stages of foreclosure, but they treated it as their final war room. Their panic should have led them to contact criminal defense attorneys and prepare for federal indictments. Any rational human being facing a coordinated multi-agency asset freeze would have understood that the game was entirely over. But my family did not operate within the bounds of reality. They operated within an impenetrable echo chamber of supreme entitlement. They could not fathom that Jamal had actually committed massive wire fraud. They refused to believe that Richard and Cynthia had been financially incompetent enough to sign away their wealth. The only logical explanation their fractured minds could accept was the one Jamal had been aggressively selling them. It was all Emma. Listening to the audio transcripts of their frantic living room meeting was like studying the psychology of absolute delusion. Richard paced the hardwood floors, bellowing about corporate overreach and insubordination. Cynthia wept, clutching her remaining authentic designer bags, wailing that I was trying to murder the family out of sheer spite. Brittany was practically hyperventilating, claiming my jealousy had driven me completely insane. Jamal loudly proclaimed that I had maliciously hacked the Apex Core mainframe to inject false data into the federal risk assessment algorithm simply to frame him. They had convinced themselves that I was nothing more than a mid-level data analyst who had gone completely rogue. They believed I had abused a low-level security clearance to trigger a false alarm within a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. And from that staggering delusion, they birthed a truly disastrous plan of attack. Since I had refused to sign Jamal's fabricated confession, they decided they would take the matter over my head. They would go directly to my superiors. Richard, utilizing the booming confidence of a man who still believed he was a respected titan of industry, declared that they would march straight into the global headquarters of Apex Core. They would not leave until they secured an audience with the executive board and the elusive, unpublicized CEO of the company. They planned to slam Jamal's fake affidavit onto the boardroom table and expose my supposed cyber terrorism. Their logic was incredibly twisted, but perfectly aligned with their arrogance. They assumed the executives at Apex Core would be horrified to discover that a bitter, low-level employee had manipulated their flawless algorithms to conduct a personal vendetta. They believed the board would instantly terminate my employment, beg for Jamal's forgiveness, and immediately contact the federal regulators to retract the fraud alert to avoid a massive corporate defamation lawsuit. They genuinely thought they could demand the reinstatement of Jamal's lucrative vendor contract and walk out of the building as victorious martyrs. Elena read the transcript of their plan aloud, her voice laced with profound professional disbelief. "They are actually coming here," she stated, lowering the tablet and looking at me. "They are getting into Richard's vehicle right now. They intend to storm the lobby and demand a meeting with the CEO of Apex Core." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter liquid coat my throat. The sheer poetry of their stupidity was almost beautiful. They were willingly walking into the absolute epicenter of my power, believing they were arriving to enact my destruction. "Notify the ground floor security teams," I instructed, my voice steady and cold. "When Richard, Cynthia, Brittany, and Jamal arrive, they are not to be stopped. Do not ask them for identification. Do not force them to sign the visitor logs. Have the concierge greet them with the utmost respect and immediately escort them to the private executive elevators." Elena's lips curved into a sharp, predatory smile. "You want them brought all the way up to the apex level. Take them directly to the primary glass boardroom," I replied, turning my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below. "Ensure the room is fully prepped. Have David Sterling waiting to receive them. Let them arrange their fabricated evidence and prepare their self-righteous demands. I want them to feel completely empowered right up until the exact second the floor vanishes beneath their feet." "Consider it done," Elena said, turning on her heel to execute the protocol. I sat alone in the quiet luxury of my office, listening to the faint hum of the servers several floors below. My family wanted to speak to the manager. They wanted to expose me to the person who controlled my fate. They were about to discover that the vulnerable, discarded daughter they had spent a lifetime tearing down was the architect of the very universe they were trying to conquer. The cage was locked, and I was ready to pull the curtain back. The digital feed on my wall monitor showed a sleek black SUV braking violently outside the main entrance of the Apex Core tower. I watched as all 4 doors swung open simultaneously. My family spilled onto the pristine pavement, looking like a disorganized mob. The initial plan was to let David Sterling handle their arrival and enjoy the show from the comfort of my executive suite. However, watching Richard march toward the revolving glass doors with Jamal trailing anxiously behind him changed my mind. The opportunity to personally intercept their manufactured crusade was simply too exquisite to pass up. I wanted to smell the panic on them. I tapped the obsidian surface of my desk, closing the security feed. I bypassed the main corridors and walked directly to my private executive elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The lobby of Apex Core was designed to be an architectural marvel of corporate intimidation. It was a cavernous expanse of polished white marble, brushed titanium, and towering holographic displays streaming real-time global financial data. The security was entirely biometric and flawlessly discreet. Suited personnel operated with silent efficiency, blending into the background while maintaining absolute control. It was a space that demanded reverence. My family brought only chaos. As the elevator descended silently through the core of the building, the lobby audio feed piped into my earpiece. Richard's voice was already echoing off the marble walls, thick with unearned authority. He had bypassed the automated visitor registration kiosks entirely and marched straight to the central concierge desk. He slammed the flat of his hand against the sleek glass counter, leaning aggressively toward the lead receptionist. "We demand an audience with the chief executive officer immediately," Richard bellowed, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "We have irrefutable proof of a massive internal security breach. One of your mid-level analysts has gone completely rogue and is currently utilizing your proprietary software to conduct illegal personal vendettas. You need to call your superiors down here right now, before this entire company is dragged into a federal lawsuit." The receptionist, a highly trained professional who had already been briefed by Elena Rostova, remained perfectly serene. "Sir," she replied, her voice even and accommodating, "if you would please lower your voice." "Do not tell my husband to lower his voice," Cynthia shrieked, stepping up beside Richard. Her diamond earrings caught the harsh overhead lighting, but her eyes were frantic, darting nervously at the security personnel who were beginning to slowly converge on the scene. "We are trying to save this company from a multi-billion-dollar scandal. You should be thanking us. You need to get your boss down here." Jamal stood slightly behind them, clutching the fabricated legal affidavit against his chest like a bulletproof vest. He looked physically ill. The sheer scale of the Apex Core headquarters, the undeniable wealth and power radiating from every surface, was clearly short-circuiting his bravado. He was a small-time con artist, standing in the nerve center of a global empire, and the reality of his insignificance was finally beginning to penetrate his delusion. Brittany, meanwhile, was performing for an invisible audience. She had her mobile device raised, recording the entire interaction. She was panning the camera around the lobby, capturing the approaching security guards, preparing to document her heroic triumph over her supposedly toxic sister. "Look at this," she said loudly to her phone. "This company is protecting a criminal. We are here to expose the truth, and they are trying to silence us." The private elevator touched down on the ground floor with a soft, melodic chime. The heavy, polished steel doors slid open silently. I stepped out into the lobby, the ambient temperature feeling suddenly cooler. I stood at the edge of the vast marble floor, watching the spectacle unfold. It took exactly 3 seconds for Brittany to spot me. Her camera whipped around, focusing directly on my face. Her eyes widened with malicious delight. "There she is!" Brittany screamed, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "There is the rogue employee." Richard, Cynthia, and Jamal spun around simultaneously. The relief that washed over their faces was almost tragic. They truly believed I was a trapped animal who had just wandered out of hiding. They abandoned the concierge desk and surged toward me, a wave of desperate, arrogant fury. "Emma, you foolish, arrogant girl!" Richard thundered, marching across the lobby with heavy, aggressive strides. "It is completely over. Your little game is finished. We are taking this directly to the top. We are handing this confession over to the board of directors and ensuring you are walked out of this building in federal handcuffs." Cynthia trailed right beside him, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. "You thought you could ruin us?" She spat, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. You thought you could destroy your own family and get away with it. You are going to lose everything: your job, your reputation, and your child. Jamal stopped a few feet away, holding up the fabricated affidavit. The guards are right behind us, Emma, he said, his voice laced with a desperate, trembling triumph. Sign the paper now. Confess to the hack. It is your absolute last chance to avoid prison. 6 members of the Apex Core security team had formed a tight perimeter around us, their expressions unreadable, their postures braced for action. They were waiting for a single command to physically restrain my family and remove them from the premises. Brittany turned her camera toward the guards, her voice shrill and commanding. Arrest her, she demanded. She is the one who committed the cybercrimes. Grab her. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply caught the eye of Marcus, the head of ground security, who was standing directly behind Richard. I gave him a single subtle nod of my head, accompanied by a minuscule downward motion of my right hand. Marcus immediately tapped his earpiece. Stand down, he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Fall back! The 6 massive security guards instantly relaxed their aggressive postures, taking 2 synchronized steps backward and folding their hands neatly in front of them. They formed a silent honor guard flanking me, completely ignoring Richard's blustering commands. My family froze. The sudden shift in the power dynamic confused them. They looked at the highly trained security team, then back at me, unable to process why the guards had instantly obeyed the silent command of a mid-level data analyst. The reality of the situation was hovering right in front of them, massive and undeniable, but their lifelong conditioning refused to let them see it. I looked at the 4 of them, studying the fear and the confusion slowly replacing the arrogant triumph on their faces. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a slow, chilling smile. You want to see the CEO? I asked, my voice perfectly calm, echoing slightly in the quiet marble lobby. Richard blinked, thrown completely off balance by my lack of fear. We are demanding to see them, yes. We are going to expose everything you have done. I held his gaze for a long, terrible moment before turning on my heel. Follow me, I said simply. I walked toward the private executive elevator bank. It was separated from the main employee elevators by a wall of tinted smart glass and a biometric security scanner that rejected 99% of the building's badges. My family hesitated for only a fraction of a second before following me, their self-righteousness propelling them forward like blind cattle. I stopped in front of the sleek black scanning terminal. I did not use a standard employee identification badge. I reached into my blazer pocket and withdrew a solid black titanium keycard. It was unmarked, devoid of any corporate logo or employee identification number. It was the master skeleton key granted only to the supreme architect of the entire network. I swiped the heavy metal card against the reader. The terminal emitted a sharp musical trill, and the LED indicator instantly shifted from red to a brilliant, pulsing green. The smart glass partitioned wall dissolved from opaque black to completely transparent, allowing access to the single elevator that ran uninterrupted to the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing an interior of brushed dark steel and mirrored surfaces. I stepped inside and turned around, pressing the button for the absolute highest floor in the tower. I looked out at Richard, Cynthia, Brittany, and Jamal, who were standing frozen outside the doors, staring at the solid black card in my hand with dawning horror. Well, I asked, my voice soft and lethal. Are you coming? The 4 of them shuffled forward, stepping across the threshold, as if walking onto a gallows. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a definitive mechanical seal, cutting off the ambient noise of the lobby entirely. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. As the elevator engaged, there was no sensation of movement, only a subtle pressure pulling at our feet as we accelerated vertically at a terrifying speed. The digital floor indicator above the door began to climb in a blur of red illuminated numbers. 30, 40, 50. Jamal was practically hyperventilating, his back pressed flat against the mirrored wall of the cabin. His eyes darted wildly, taking in the sterile, windowless box. He was a man who had built a career on fast-talking his way out of mid-level corporate disputes, and he was now acutely aware that he was hurtling toward a stratosphere of power he could not manipulate. Cynthia stood rigid, her manicured fingers twisting the strap of her handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Brittany kept her phone raised, though her screen displayed a flashing error message. The Apex elevator was shielded by a military-grade signal dampener. Her live stream to her sycophantic followers had been severed the second the doors closed. Richard, however, refused to surrender his manufactured authority. He adjusted his silk tie, his breathing ragged but his chin thrust forward aggressively. "You have made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life, Emma," he growled, his voice echoing harshly in the confined space. "Did you honestly believe we would let you terrorize this family from behind a computer screen? We are going to hand this confession directly to your superiors. We are going to ensure you are prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of federal law. You are going to be locked away, and Leo will finally be placed in a proper stable home." I did not blink. I did not shift my gaze. I stood perfectly still in the center of the elevator, watching his reflection in the polished steel doors. Let him speak, I thought. Let him dig the trench a few feet deeper. The digital counter hit the 80th floor, and the elevator decelerated with a smooth, frictionless glide. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the executive summit of Apex Core. If the lobby was designed to intimidate, the Apex level was designed to inspire sheer, unadulterated awe. There were no cubicles, no ringing telephones, no frantic analysts rushing between departments. The entire floor was a vast, open expanse of dark slate brushed titanium and seamless panoramic glass. The exterior walls were entirely transparent, offering a dizzying, unobstructed view of the metropolis sprawling endlessly beneath us like a miniature toy city. We were literally above the clouds, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the high-altitude sun. The silence here was not empty. It was the heavy, expensive silence of absolute control. My family stepped out of the elevator cautiously, their bravado momentarily short-circuited by the staggering opulence of the environment. They had expected a busy corporate floor where they could cause a scene and demand a manager. Instead, they had walked into a fortress of solitude. Standing at the far end of the corridor, flanking a set of massive floor-to-ceiling frosted glass doors, was David Sterling. He wore an impeccably tailored dark suit, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, projecting the intimidating aura of a high-level corporate executioner. Richard spotted him and immediately straightened his posture, eager to establish dominance. He marched down the slate corridor, leaving Jamal, Cynthia, and Brittany trailing anxiously behind him. Richard extended a hand as he approached David, putting on his most practiced, commanding smile. "I am Richard Sterling," he announced, his voice booming unpleasantly in the quiet corridor. "I presume you are the executive officer in charge of this division. We are here to report a catastrophic breach of security." The woman behind me. "Emma has gone completely rogue. She has illegally manipulated your federal risk assessment algorithms to conduct a personal vendetta against my son-in-law. We demand an immediate audience with the chief executive officer to rectify this situation before we are forced to involve our legal team." David did not take Richard's extended hand. He did not even look at him. David's eyes remained fixed on me as I walked slowly down the corridor, closing the distance between us. When I reached the doors, David offered a brief, deeply respectful bow of his head. "The boardroom is prepared," David stated, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. Richard, entirely misreading the interaction, assumed David was simply an obedient corporate drone, following a strict protocol for disciplinary tribunals. "Excellent," Richard snapped, dropping his hand and glaring at me. "It is time to face the music, Emma. Get inside." David pressed a panel on the wall, and the heavy frosted glass doors slid apart, revealing the primary executive boardroom. It was a masterpiece of intimidating design. A massive, elongated table carved from a single piece of dark petrified wood dominated the center of the room. High-backed black leather chairs lined the sides. The far wall was a continuous pane of reinforced glass, looking out over the sheer drop to the city below, creating the visceral illusion that the room was suspended in mid-air. My family filed into the room, instantly gravitating toward the side of the table nearest the door. Jamal practically collapsed into one of the chairs, tossing his fabricated legal affidavit onto the polished wood. Cynthia and Brittany stood behind him, crossing their arms, glaring at me with vindictive anticipation. They were waiting for the tribunal to begin. They were waiting for the CEO to emerge from a hidden door and terminate my employment. "Stand in the corner," Emma Richard ordered, pointing a trembling finger toward the far wall. "Do not speak until you are spoken to. You have humiliated this family enough for one lifetime." I did not stand in the corner. I ignored his pointing finger and walked deliberately past him. I walked past Jamal, who was frantically wiping sweat from his upper lip. I walked the entire length of the petrified wood table, the soft click of my heels the only sound in the cavernous room. I reached the solitary, oversized leather chair positioned at the absolute head of the table, the seat of power, the throne that commanded the entire room and the empire beyond it. I turned around, met Richard's furious, confused gaze, and slowly sat down. The supple leather yielded silently beneath me as I rested my forearms on the polished wood and steeped my fingers. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in a vacuum of utter disbelief. Then Richard's mind violently rejected what his eyes were showing him. The delusion snapped back into place, fiercer and more desperate than before. "Get out of that chair!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He marched down the length of the table, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. He stopped a few feet away from me and slammed his open palm down onto the petrified wood with a deafening crack. "What is wrong with you?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Are you trying to get us all sent to federal prison? You are a mid-level analyst. You are a criminal. You do not sit in the chief executive's chair. Get up right now before they walk in here and have you arrested for trespassing. Get out of the chair, Emma." He slammed his hand against the desk again, the sharp sound echoing off the glass walls. But I did not move. I remained perfectly still, looking up at him from the seat of absolute authority, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. The echo of his palm striking the petrified wood was still ringing sharply in the air when the heavy frosted glass doors at the end of the boardroom glided apart. The sudden movement drew Richard's attention, halting his furious tirade mid-breath. He pivoted, his chest puffed out and his face flushed with righteous indignation, fully prepared to unleash his rehearsed demands upon whoever had dared to interrupt his disciplinary performance. 3 figures walked into the room, their footsteps muffled by the thick premium carpet. Leading the group was a woman with sharp silver hair, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, the chief legal officer of Apex Corp. Beside her walked the chief financial officer, a man whose stern expression suggested he only dealt in absolute numerical certainties. Flanking them both was the head of security, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a former military operative. Richard immediately opened his mouth, raising his hand to point at me, ready to present Jamal's fabricated affidavit and demand my arrest. The 3 executives completely ignored him. They did not spare my father a single glance, bypassing him with smooth, synchronized efficiency, as if he were nothing more than a minor architectural obstruction. They ignored Cynthia's indignant gasp and Brittany's confused glare. They walked straight past Jamal, who was still clutching the edge of the table, his breath coming in shallow, panicked rasps. The chief legal officer stopped directly in front of my chair. The chief financial officer stepped forward and placed a massive leather-bound portfolio squarely in the center of the desk, aligning it perfectly with my resting hands. The head of security took a protective stance slightly behind my right shoulder, his gaze sweeping the room with cold, clinical detachment. "Madame CEO," the chief legal officer said, her voice crisp, respectful, and carrying with absolute clarity across the vast expanse of the boardroom. "The fraud dossier on Jamal is ready for your signature. All federal asset freezes have been fully executed across his global accounts, and the digital logs are prepared for immediate transfer to the Department of Justice." The words hung in the air, suspended in a vacuum of absolute suffocating silence. Time seemed to fracture within the glass walls of the room, slowing down to a crawling, agonizing pace as those 2 words registered in the minds of my family. "Madam CEO." It was a title that completely short-circuited their reality. The visceral shockwave hit them with the force of a physical blow, sucking all the oxygen directly out of the room. The grand impenetrable illusion of their superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces raining down around them in real time. I watched Richard's hand, the same hand he had just used to violently strike my desk, begin to tremble uncontrollably. The aggressive posture dissolved his shoulders, slumping as the hand slipped off the polished wood and fell limply to his side. His mouth worked silently, his jaw opening and closing, as he tried to form words that his destroyed worldview could no longer support. The furious titan of industry vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified old man who suddenly realized he was standing in the throne room of an empire he could not comprehend. Jamal staggered backward, as if the chief legal officer had physically struck him in the chest. His knees gave out entirely, and he collapsed heavily into one of the black leather chairs. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The fabricated confession he had brought, the supposed masterstroke that was going to save his fraudulent empire, fluttered uselessly from his loose grip. It landed face down on the carpet, a pathetic piece of fiction entirely eclipsed by the massive legally binding dossier resting under my hands. He finally understood the apocalyptic scale of his mistake. He had tried to frame the architect of the federal risk assessment software. He had tried to extort the owner of a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. Behind him, Cynthia let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. Her hands flew to her throat, her diamond rings catching the high-altitude sunlight streaming through the windows. She reached out blindly to grip Brittany's arm for support, but Brittany was completely frozen, rendered immobile by pure shock. The phone Brittany had been holding like a weapon slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered loudly onto the floor. The screen cracked upon impact, a spider web of fractured glass perfectly mirroring the sudden total destruction of her petty, vindictive rivalry. The jealous, bitter sister, she thought she could bully into submission the woman she had threatened to destroy on social media, simply did not exist. In her place sat the undisputed ruler of Apex Core, holding the power to annihilate them all with a single stroke of a pen. The dynamic in the room had shifted with tectonic force, leaving them stranded on an island of their own making. They were bankrupt, they were facing federal prison, and the only person standing between them and absolute permanent ruin was the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like disposable garbage. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic monologue about karma or justice. The silence that followed the chief legal officer's statement was far more devastating than any words I could ever speak. I calmly reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and withdrew a heavy platinum fountain pen. I uncapped it with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled the massive fraud dossier toward me, my eyes never leaving Richard's horrified, pale face. I flipped open the heavy leather cover, the crisp rustle of the premium paper echoing against the glass walls. I smoothed my hand over the signature line at the bottom of the federal authorization form, projecting a cold, calculated composure that offered absolutely no mercy. I poised the platinum nib of the pen over the paper, holding their collective fate firmly in my hand, allowing them to drown in the absolute certainty of their own destruction. I poised the platinum nib of the pen over the paper, holding their collective fate firmly in my hand, allowing them to drown in the absolute certainty of their own destruction. I let the silence stretch for precisely 30 seconds. It was a calculated, deliberate pause. I watched the realization slowly seep into their bones, watching the blood drain from their faces as they stared at the heavy platinum pen in my hand. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, I lowered the pen. I did not sign the document. Not yet. I picked up the thick, leather-bound dossier and flipped it open, turning it so the stark clinical spreadsheets and heavily redacted federal documents faced them. The sharp scent of freshly printed paper and cold toner filled the space between us. I did not smile. I did not gloat. There was no need for theatrics when the truth was this devastating. I simply became all business, shifting into the exact corporate persona that had built this empire from the ground up. I began with the architect of their misery, Jamal. I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. Your entire corporate structure is a mirage. I slid the first set of glossy prospectuses across the smooth surface of the petrified wood. You pitched massive urban revitalization projects to my procurement team. You promised high-yield returns on sustainable commercial developments. But there are no construction permits. There are no zoning approvals. There are no land acquisitions in any of the districts you claim to be developing. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to launch into one of his signature charming deflections, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just had the air forcefully extracted from his lungs. What you did possess. I continued pulling a dense stack of banking records and sliding them next to the prospectuses was a highly sophisticated network of offshore shell companies. You utilized these phantom entities to artificially inflate your revenue streams, presenting yourself as a highly successful real estate mogul to secure initial vendor contracts with Apex Core. You operated a textbook Ponzi scheme, moving non-existent capital from one fake ledger to another to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. I turned my gaze away from his pale, sweating face and looked directly at my parents. Richard was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Cynthia looked as though she might faint, her eyes darting between me and the documents. This is where your involvement becomes tragic, I stated, locking eyes with my father. I reached into the dossier and produced a series of heavily notarized loan agreements and property deeds. When Jamal's initial capital dried up, when the phantom returns failed to materialize, and his offshore creditors began demanding payment, he needed liquid assets to maintain the facade. He needed a reliable, desperate source of cash. He came to you. We invested, Richard croaked, his voice sounding brittle and weak, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. We are the primary stakeholders in the downtown commercial initiative. Jamal guaranteed the returns. You are primary stakeholders in nothing. I corrected, my tone unwavering. You did not invest. You served as an unwitting, deeply gullible piggy bank. Jamal used your blind faith in his charm and your absolute desperation to maintain a wealthy public image to bleed you completely dry. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the top document in the stack. He convinced you to sign over the secondary lines of credit attached to your remaining business assets. When that was no longer sufficient to cover his massive debts, he went further. I slid the paperwork closer to Richard. He forged your signatures on a series of aggressive, high-risk, uncollateralized loans. He used your primary estate, the house you are currently living in, as the final collateral. Cynthia let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hands flew to her throat, her heavy diamond rings catching the harsh light streaming through the panoramic windows. The country club barbecue, I said, shifting my attention to my mother. The imported vintage champagne, the expensive catered staff, the custom designer dresses you so proudly flaunted while berating me and treating me like a pathetic charity case. You were celebrating with ghost money. Every single extravagant purchase you have made over the last 8 months was funded by your own impending bankruptcy. The luxury you wielded as a weapon against me was financed by the systematic destruction of your entire life savings. The air in the boardroom grew thick and suffocating as the reality of their total financial ruin finally set in. They had built their entire identities around wealth, social status, and their perceived superiority over me. Now, sitting in the shadow of my genuine, unassailable power, they were confronted with the terrifying truth that they owned absolutely nothing. Their entire existence was a hollow shell, and Jamal had just crushed it into dust. Brittany, who had remained frozen near the heavy glass doors, finally found her voice. "That is a lie," she whispered. Her voice trembled, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, as if trying to physically shield herself from the truth. "Jamal is rich. He bought me the luxury SUV. He paid for Leo's private school tuition. He is taking care of us." I looked at my sister, feeling a profound clinical detachment from her delusion. "He bought your loyalty with stolen funds," I stated, pulling the final set of wire transfer logs from the dossier. "The vehicle you are driving is a short-term lease registered to a shell corporation, that was seized by federal regulators precisely 2 hours ago. As for the tuition, I slid a single stamped piece of paper across the table. The check he wrote for Leo's school bounced yesterday morning due to insufficient funds. Richard slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The realization of the profound, devastating betrayal finally pierced through his lifelong arrogance. The golden son-in-law he had championed, the man he had repeatedly chosen over his own daughter, had systematically dismantled his entire life. "You told me the returns were guaranteed," Richard whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying, quiet fury. "You said the banks were just finalizing the paperwork. You told me Emma was the one trying to ruin us." Jamal shrank back into the black leather chair, unable to meet my father's horrified gaze. The smooth-talking hustler had finally run out of lies, cornered in a glass room thousands of feet above the city, exposed by the very woman he had tried to destroy. I sat back in the oversized executive chair, watching the wreckage of my family smolder in the cold light of reality. I sat back in the oversized executive chair, watching the wreckage of my family smolder in the cold light of reality. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the boardroom was the ragged, uneven breathing of my father. Then the shock holding him together completely vaporized. The rigid posture of the imperious patriarch shattered, replaced by the primal, unhinged fury of a man who had just been stripped of everything that made him feel superior. Richard let out a guttural, terrifying roar that tore from deep within his chest. He lunged across the polished, petrified wood table, his hands hooking into the lapels of Jamal's custom-tailored suit. The sudden violence sent Jamal's leather chair tipping backward. The two men crashed onto the dark slate floor in a tangle of flailing limbs and expensive fabric. My father, fueled by the adrenaline of absolute ruin, pinned Jamal down, his hands wrapping tightly around his son-in-law's throat. "You stole my life," Richard screamed, spit flying onto Jamal's terrified face. "You took my home. I will kill you. I will tear you apart with my bare hands." David, the head of security, shifted his weight, his hand dropping smoothly to his utility belt, but I raised a single finger. David paused, holding his position. I did not want them separated. I wanted to watch. Jamal gagged, clawing frantically at Richard's tightening grip. Survival instinct overrode his usual cowardice. With a desperate heave, Jamal drove his knee upward, catching Richard hard in the ribs. The older man gasped, his grip loosening just enough for Jamal to twist free. Jamal scrambled backward across the premium carpet, his suit jacket torn, his silk tie hanging in shredded ruins. He scrambled to his feet, panting heavily, his eyes wild and darting around the room like a trapped animal. "You think this is entirely on me?" Jamal shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched register of pure panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Brittany, who shrank back against the panoramic glass wall. "Do not act like you are innocent in this, you greedy, insatiable parasite." Brittany's eyes widened in horror. "Shut up!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with fear. Jamal did not shut up. He stepped toward her, his terror morphing into vicious, vindictive rage. "You forced me into this," he yelled, his voice echoing harshly off the glass. "You demanded the lifestyle. You demanded the country club memberships, the designer bags, the luxury vacations you could flaunt online to people who do not even care about you. Do you know how much debt she has?" he demanded, turning back to Richard and Cynthia. "She has maxed out 14 separate credit cards. 14. She was draining my legitimate accounts faster than I could fill them." The moment I told her the initial development deals were stalling, she did not care. Jamal spat out, his chest heaving. "She told me to figure it out. She told me she refused to be seen driving a domestic car or living in a neighborhood that lacked a gate. She explicitly told me to borrow from you, Richard. She said you had plenty of capital and that you owed her for putting up with Emma's supposed jealousy all these years." "That is a lie," Brittany shrieked, launching herself forward. She swung her handbag wildly at Jamal, the heavy metal buckle striking him on the shoulder. "You are a failure. You promised me an empire. You said you were a real estate tycoon. You are nothing but a cheap con artist who ruined my public image. My entire brand is destroyed. I am a victim here." Then Cynthia broke. It started as a low, keening wail that originated deep within her chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. The matriarch, who had spent her entire existence obsessing over appearances, polishing her social armor, and looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her, completely unraveled. She sank to her knees right there in the boardroom, her hands clutching her perfectly styled hair, tearing at the strands until they fell around her face in a wild, chaotic mess. "My house!" Cynthia wailed, rocking back and forth on the slate floor. "My beautiful house. The gala is next month. The charity luncheon. How am I supposed to show my face? We have nothing. We are homeless." She suddenly stopped rocking and snapped her head up to glare at Richard, who was still kneeling on the floor, clutching his bruised ribs. "You fool," she screamed at her husband. Her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "You stupid, arrogant old fool. I told you to review those contracts. I told you to have an independent accountant look at his proposals, but you wanted to play the grand benefactor. You wanted to brag to the entire country club that your son-in-law was a financial prodigy. You handed him the keys to our entire existence because you liked the sound of your own voice." Richard roared back at her, struggling to his feet, his face a mottled, dangerous purple. "Do not dare blame this on me, Cynthia. You were the one spending thousands on redecorating the summer home based on phantom dividends. You were the one pushing to invest more so we could buy that yacht before the Hendersons did. You are just as responsible for this catastrophe as anyone else in this miserable family." They were all shouting now, a cacophony of ugly, bitter recriminations. Brittany screamed that Richard and Cynthia had set her up for failure by forcing her to marry for status. Jamal laughed hysterically, taunting Richard that he possessed no money to hire lawyers and would rot in a state-run nursing home. Cynthia shrieked that she wished she had never met any of them. The illusion of the perfect, wealthy, successful family had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but venom and greed. I sat perfectly still at the head of the petrified wood table, my hands resting lightly over the dossier of their ruin. The chief legal officer, the chief financial officer, and David all watched the spectacle with cold professional disgust. But I watched with an overwhelming sense of finality. I did not speak. I did not need to. The toxic parasitic ecosystem that had defined my family for my entire life was actively consuming itself right in front of me. The mask of familial loyalty, the unified front they had always presented to systematically tear me down, had dissolved the instant the money disappeared. Stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their manufactured superiority, they were nothing but starving wolves, locked in a cage, tearing at each other's throats for survival. The violent crescendo of their infighting snapped just as suddenly as it had begun. The cavernous boardroom moments ago, echoing with vicious accusations and physical scuffles, fell into a heavy, panting stillness. Richard stood hunched over, clutching his bruised ribs, his breath whistling through his teeth. Jamal remained on the floor, wiping a smear of blood from his split lip, entirely defeated. But it was Brittany who broke the silence, her eyes widening as the true gravity of the chief legal officer's words finally penetrated her panic-stricken mind. She looked at the massive dossier under my hands. She looked at the chief financial officer standing silently at attention. She looked at the sprawling metropolis visible through the panoramic glass, a city over which this very boardroom presided. The math finally clicked into place. The realization washed over her face, wiping away the bitter, jealous bully I had known my entire life and replacing her with something utterly pathetic. I was not a mid-level analyst caught in a lie. I was not an IT grunt they could fire. I was a multimillionaire. I owned the algorithm, I owned the building, and I owned the absolute power to erase their insurmountable debts with a single signature. The transition was instantaneous and deeply grotesque. Brittany's posture of defensive rage dissolved. She took a shaky step toward the head of the table, leaving her bleeding husband on the floor without a second glance. Her expensive heels clicked unsteadily against the slate before she hit the edge of the premium carpet. Then she collapsed. My sister dropped heavily to her knees, the sharp impact muffled by the thick fabric. "Emma!" She sobbed, the sound tearing from her throat in a ragged, desperate gasp. She crawled forward, closing the distance until she was directly at my feet. She reached out, her trembling manicured fingers hovering just inches from my knees, instinctively pulling back when David shifted his weight in warning. The tears flowed freely now, ruining her flawless makeup, tracking dark lines of mascara down her cheeks. "You have to help me," Brittany begged, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "I did not know what Jamal was doing. You have to believe me, Emma. I thought his real estate company was legitimate. I thought the money was real. I am a victim in this, just like you." I did not react. I simply watched her kneel on the floor, the same woman who had spent the last decade mocking my clothes, my career, and my son. "Please," Brittany wailed, clasping her hands together in a gesture of absolute supplication. "They are going to send me to federal prison for the credit card fraud. They are going to take everything, but you can stop it. You are the CEO. You own this entire empire. You are a multi-millionaire, Emma. The debt Jamal racked up, the money we owe, it is nothing to you. It is pocket change. Just write a check, buy the debt from the banks, pay off the shell companies. We are sisters, Emma. We shared a room. We grew up together. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot let them lock your own flesh and blood in a cage." As Brittany's pleas filled the room, the scent of salvation triggered a chain reaction. Cynthia, who had been weeping hysterically over her lost social status, suddenly stopped. She watched Brittany begging at my feet, and the matriarch of the family made her own horrific pivot. The pride that had fueled decades of emotional abuse vanished, entirely subsumed by the primal instinct for financial survival. Cynthia scrambled forward, literally crawling on her hands and knees across the boardroom floor to position herself right next to Brittany. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess, her designer dress wrinkled and twisted, but she forced her face into a mask of cloying maternal desperation. "She is right, darling," Cynthia whimpers, reaching out to clutch the armrest of my leather chair. "We are your family. We are your blood. We made mistakes, yes. We were hard on you, but you have to understand, it was only because we saw this greatness inside of you. We pushed you because we knew you were capable of achieving this incredible success. We are so fiercely proud of you, Emma." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her words hung in the air, a toxic vapor that was almost difficult to breathe. She was attempting to rewrite 30 years of targeted cruelty as tough love, weaponizing the concept of family to save her sinking ship. And then Cynthia deployed her ultimate, most despicable manipulation. "Think of sweet little Leo," she cried, clutching her chest as if wounded. "My beautiful, precious grandson. I have always loved that little boy, Emma. I have always wanted the absolute best for him. You know I have. Do you really want him growing up knowing his grandparents and his aunt were destroyed? Do you want him to carry the shame of our bankruptcy? You have the power to fix this for him. You can buy our estate back from the bank. You can set up a trust to clear our names. Do it for Leo's sake, Emma. Be the bigger person for your son." Even Richard, the proud, unyielding tyrant, could not resist the gravitational pull of my sudden wealth. He did not crawl, but he shuffled forward, his shoulders completely bowed, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He stopped beside his kneeling wife and daughter, a broken shell of a man. Emma, Richard rasped, his voice devoid of any of its former booming authority. "Madam CEO, I was wrong. I admit it. I see the truth now. You are the true success of this bloodline. We do not need a handout. We just need a bridge loan, a temporary influx of capital to clear the offshore ledgers and satisfy the federal regulators. You have the liquidity. We can work for you. I will work for you. Just name your terms." I sat in the oversized leather chair, looking down at the three of them clustered at my feet. They were weeping, grasping, and groveling, entirely stripped of their dignity. They were crawling for scraps, desperately trying to manipulate the very emotions they had spent a lifetime trying to beat out of me. The spectacle was a masterclass in human desperation, a complete collapse of ego in the face of absolute power. I let their frantic, pathetic begging wash over me, absorbing the full measure of their hypocrisy before I prepared to deliver my final judgment. I looked down at the three of them, a pathetic tableau of ruined vanity and desperate greed sprawled across the slate floor of my boardroom. For years, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. I had envisioned a fiery surge of vindication, a triumphant rush of adrenaline as the people who had tortured me finally faced their reckoning. Instead, gazing at my mother's tear-stained face, my sister's trembling hands, and my father's bowed head, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy had run completely dry, scorched away by decades of their relentless cruelty. There was no joy in this, only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a balanced equation. "You want to talk about blood," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying with absolute clarity through the cavernous room. "You want to invoke the sacred bond of family now that your bank accounts are empty and the federal authorities are knocking at your door. You did not think about blood when you banished me to the kitchen during your lavish parties. You did not think about family when you mocked my career, belittled my intelligence, and treated me like a humiliating stain on your pristine social record." I shifted my gaze to Cynthia, whose hands were still white-knuckled around the armrest of my chair. "And you dare to invoke my son. You dare to use Leo as a bargaining chip to save your stolen mansion." Cynthia gasped, shaking her head frantically. "No, Emma, I swear it. I love him. He is my grandson." "Stop!" I commanded, the words slicing through the air like a physical blade. "You do not love Leo. You have never loved him. You looked at him with the exact same disgust you reserved for me. You called him a burden. You called him a mistake. You allowed Brittany to parade her child around as the golden heir while actively pretending mine did not exist. You do not get to claim the title of grandmother now that it comes with a financial parachute. You lost that right the moment you let this man." I gestured toward Jamal, who was still cowering on the floor, "fund your country club lifestyle with fraudulent cash." Richard tried to push himself up on one knee, his face contorted with a desperate pleading agony. "We will change, Emma. We will do whatever you ask. Just give us a chance to make it right. We are begging you." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy leather dossier. I looked directly into my father's eyes, seeing the exact moment his final sliver of hope began to evaporate. I remembered the barbecue. I remembered the scorching afternoon sun, the smell of roasted meat, and the sneering, mocking faces of my family as I asked for a simple, modest loan to secure a safe neighborhood for my child. I remembered the absolute delight they took in rejecting me, the performative cruelty of their dismissal. "I am sorry," I said quietly, the words dropping like stones into a bottomless well. "But my money is only for kids with a future." The impact of the callback was instantaneous and absolute. Richard recoiled as if I had shot him. The breath hitched in his throat, and the remaining color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. He recognized the words immediately. The memory of his own arrogant cruelty mirrored back at him from the seat of absolute power was the final fatal blow to his psyche. He understood with terrifying clarity that there was no negotiation, there was no forgiveness. There was only the consequence of his own actions. Cynthia let out a high, piercing scream, burying her face in her hands as the finality of my statement crushed her. Brittany collapsed completely flat against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the premium carpet, her fingers digging into the fibers, as if trying to hide from the reality of her impending incarceration. I did not linger on their despair. I had work to do. I picked up the platinum fountain pen. I turned the final page of the dossier, exposing the federal authorization transfer line. With swift, fluid motions, I signed my name. The scratch of the nib against the heavy paper was the only sound cutting through the chorus of their weeping. I capped the pen, laid it down, and closed the heavy leather cover with a definitive thud. I pushed the dossier across the petrified wood desk. The chief legal officer stepped forward immediately, picking up the massive file and tucking it securely under her arm. "Have this couriered directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I instructed, my tone purely operational. "Ensure the Department of Justice receives the digital logs of the offshore transfers before the hour is up. Freeze every residual asset connected to Jamal's shell companies and initiate the asset seizure protocols on the properties listed as collateral. Yes, Madam CEO, she replied, offering a crisp nod before turning on her heel and marching out of the boardroom, taking the last remnants of my family's stolen empire with her. I turned my attention to David, who had been standing with stoic, unreadable patience behind my shoulder. David, I said, my voice echoing in the large space. Please escort these unauthorized individuals out of my building. They are permanently banned from the premises. If they resist, you are authorized to involve local law enforcement for trespassing. Understood, David replied. He raised a hand to his earpiece, murmuring a quick, sharp command. Within seconds, the frosted glass doors slid completely open. 4 massive security guards in dark suits marched into the boardroom, their expressions set in stone. They did not hesitate. They moved with military precision, grabbing Richard and Jamal by the arms and hauling them forcefully to their feet. Jamal offered no resistance, his body entirely limp, his mind broken. Richard tried to dig his heels into the carpet, babbling incoherently, but the guards easily overpowered him, dragging him toward the exit. 2 other guards hoisted Cynthia and Brittany from the floor. Brittany was screaming now, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror, her legs kicking wildly as they lifted her by the armpits. Cynthia was begging, pleading for mercy, her manicured hands grasping blindly at the air as she was hauled backward away from the table. No, please, Emma, please do not do this to us. Cynthia's voice echoed down the long slate corridor, growing fainter as the guards dragged them away. I remained seated in the oversized leather chair, staring straight ahead. I watched as they were pulled past the threshold of the boardroom. The heavy frosted glass doors began to slide shut, slowly cutting off the sight of my screaming, sobbing relatives. The gap narrowed, slicing their frantic forms into a thin sliver of movement, and then with a soft mechanical click, the doors sealed tight. The screaming was instantly muted, reduced to nothing more than a faint, distant vibration that quickly faded into absolute nothingness. The executive boardroom returned to its natural state of quiet, expensive tranquility. I was finally alone. The trap had closed, and the empire was secure. The silence of the executive boardroom was merely the calm before the storm. The moment those frosted glass doors clicked shut, the machinery of absolute ruin I had set in motion engaged with terrifying speed. The next 30 days unfolded not as a slow decline, but as a violently fast-paced montage of complete destruction. It began exactly 72 hours later. I sat at my desk and watched the live feed on the local morning news as a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the glass facade of Jamal's downtown office complex. Federal agents wearing tactical vests swarmed the lobby, moving with aggressive precision. They carried out dozens of heavy cardboard boxes filled with forged ledgers and hauled away the physical servers containing the digital footprints of his massive offshore shell game. The camera zoomed in closely as Jamal was escorted through the revolving doors in heavy steel handcuffs. His expensive custom suit was wrinkled, his face pale and slick with sweat, as rapid camera flashes illuminated his absolute terror. The Department of Justice did not hesitate or offer plea deals. By the end of the week, he was formally indicted on 32 federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and operating a massive unlicensed securities scheme. Given his extensive network of phantom offshore entities and hidden accounts, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk. Bail was unconditionally denied. The smooth-talking hustler, the architect of my family's downfall, was locked in a federal holding cell, trading his tailored Italian silk for a coarse orange jumpsuit, his future entirely erased. With Jamal imprisoned and every single asset connected to his name frozen by the federal government, Brittany's luxurious mirage evaporated overnight. The bank accounts she had relied on to blindly fund her extravagant lifestyle were locked tight, preventing even the smallest withdrawal. The short-term lease on the sprawling suburban mansion was immediately terminated, leaving her with less than a week to pack whatever she could carry. The fleet of luxury vehicles, including the imported SUV she had flaunted in my face, was towed away in the middle of the night by aggressive repossession agents. Brittany, who had spent a decade mocking my financial struggles and treating me like a pathetic charity case, suddenly found herself with absolutely nothing. Stripped of her credit cards and her manufactured status, she was forced to move into a cramped, run-down apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. There were no security gates, no manicured lawns, and no private pools. Her new reality consisted of peeling paint-stained linoleum floors and the constant buzzing of a failing neon street lamp outside her single thin window. To put food on the table and keep the electricity running, my sister had to face the ultimate humiliation. She took a minimum wage retail job at a massive, chaotic discount clothing store. I received the background reports from David detailing her new routine. She spent 8 hours a day standing on her swollen feet under harsh fluorescent lights, folding cheap polyester sweaters and sweeping up discarded plastic hangers. Her perfectly manicured nails chipped and broke. Her designer clothes were replaced by a stiff, scratchy uniform vest and a plastic name tag. She had to endure the daily indignity of serving rude, impatient customers who treated her like a servant. The most crushing blow came when former country club acquaintances wandered into the store looking for bargain holiday gifts. When they recognized the former socialite ringing up their discounted socks, they averted their eyes and hurried away, pretending they did not know her. Brittany was forced to swallow her pride, scanning barcodes with forced politeness, while drowning in the agonizing realization of how far she had fallen. My parents experienced a descent that was equally rapid and profoundly devastating. The banks moved with ruthless clinical efficiency, foreclosing on the massive, uncollateralized loans Jamal had fraudulently secured, using their primary estate as collateral. Richard and Cynthia were unceremoniously evicted from the sprawling Beacon Hill mansion they had lorded over for decades. Facing insurmountable debt and a legion of aggressive creditors, they had no choice but to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The federal bankruptcy court ordered the total liquidation of their remaining assets. I watched the auction catalog cross my desk, reading the itemized list of their vanity with clinical detachment. Cynthia's prized collection of imported European antiques, Richard's meticulously maintained vintage cars, the heavy diamond jewelry, and the designer wardrobes were all auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy mere fractions of what they owed. They were left with 2 suitcases of basic clothing and absolute zero capital. The loss of their wealth triggered the immediate and total evaporation of their social standing. The high society friends they had bankrupted themselves to impress the very people they had desperately tried to appease by disowning me completely vanished into thin air. The country club revoked their membership due to unpaid dues, posting the notice publicly for all members to see. The charity board Cynthia had ruthlessly chaired quietly removed her name from their letterheads, erasing her legacy entirely. Phone calls to former allies went straight to voicemail. Invitations to galas and luncheons simply stopped arriving. They were instantly exiled from the only world they had ever valued, treated like a contagious disease by the wealthy elite they had worshipped. With no savings and destroyed credit, they had no options left. Richard and Cynthia were forced to relocate into subsidized government housing. They moved into a stark cinderblock unit in a towering concrete complex miles away from their former kingdom. The security reports detailed a grim, suffocating existence. Richard, completely stripped of his booming patriarchal authority, spent his days sitting in a cheap vinyl chair, staring blankly at a bare white wall, unable to comprehend how his empire of arrogance had crumbled into dust. Cynthia, the woman who used to boast about imported vintage champagne and custom-catered galas, now spent her evenings heating up canned soup on a tiny, unreliable electric stove in a cramped kitchen that smelled faintly of mildew and despair. They owned nothing. They controlled nothing. The hollow identities they had built around money and perceived superiority were utterly destroyed, leaving 2 empty, bitter shells living in the permanent shadow of their own catastrophic greed. The total collapse of their toxic ecosystem was absolute and irreversible. I traded the sterile, suffocating air of the corporate boardroom for the crisp, clean scent of pine and fresh soil. Standing on the expansive cedar observation deck, I leaned against the warm wooden railing and let the afternoon sunlight wash over my face. The contrast between the cold gray concrete of my parents' newly mandated reality and the vibrant, sprawling green sanctuary before me was absolute. This was the Apex Horizon Academy. It was a cutting-edge, nature-based educational facility designed entirely from the ground up for neurodivergent children. And it was fully funded and permanently endowed by the philanthropic arm of Apex Corps. There were no harsh fluorescent lights here. There were no rigid confining desks or echoing institutional hallways. The campus was woven seamlessly into 30 acres of old-growth forest. Floor-to-ceiling structural glass erased the boundaries between the indoor therapeutic spaces and the surrounding woodlands. I watched as children engaged with sensory gardens filled with soft mosses and aromatic herbs. I saw custom-built kinetic play structures that allowed them to explore their physical boundaries safely and joyfully. Every single detail of this facility had been engineered to foster peace, understanding, and growth. It was an environment built on genuine care, completely devoid of the judgment and harsh expectations that had defined my own childhood. My gaze drifted across the central courtyard and found the only reason any of this existed. Leo was kneeling in a patch of soft clover near a gently trickling water feature. He was working alongside a specialized behavioral therapist, building a complex, intricate bridge out of smooth river stones and polished wood blocks. He was completely absorbed in the task, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. For years, I had watched my beautiful, brilliant son shrink in the presence of my family. I had watched him cover his ears and retreat into himself whenever Richard's booming voice filled a room, or whenever Cynthia directed a look of thinly veiled disgust his way. I had spent countless nights holding him while he cried, overwhelmed by a world that demanded he conform to rigid, unforgiving standards. Now looking at him in the dappled sunlight, I saw a completely different child. Leo placed the final stone on his bridge and sat back. A massive, triumphant smile broke across his face. He laughed a bright, clear sound that carried across the courtyard, and he eagerly explained his engineering process to the therapist, who listened with absolute validation and respect. He was not masking his neurodivergence. He was not shrinking to make himself palatable to ignorant, arrogant people. He was simply allowed to exist, to thrive, and to be celebrated for exactly who he was. Seeing that smile and watching him radiate pure, unadulterated joy settled a profound quiet over my soul. The millions of dollars, the corporate maneuvering, the hostile takeovers, and the ruthless dismantling of Jamal's fraudulent empire had all been leading to this singular, perfect moment. True wealth was not measured in vintage champagne country club memberships or the temporary envy of hollow high society friends. True wealth was the power to build a fortress around the people you love. It was the absolute ability to manufacture a sanctuary where your child could grow up entirely shielded from the poison of toxic people. I looked at the strong, healthy boy playing in the grass and realized I had done more than just secure a fortune. I had actively broken a generational curse. The cycle of emotional starvation and cruel conditional affection ended with me. Leo would never know what it felt like to be looked at with disappointment simply for existing. He would never have to hustle for scraps of love from people incapable of giving it. I turned away from this railing, looking directly into the lens of the reality I had forged. Society conditions us from birth to believe that blood is an unbreakable contract. We are fed a constant, relentless narrative that family is everything, that you must forgive and forgive again, simply because you share a genetic lineage. We are expected to endure disrespect, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse under the guise of familial loyalty. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our pride, and to offer endless second chances to people who actively plot our destruction. That is a dangerous, destructive lie. Blood does not entitle anyone to your peace. Shared DNA does not grant a perpetual license to inflict harm. When the people who are supposed to protect you actively choose to exploit you, when the individuals who demand your loyalty only offer betrayal in return, you have a fundamental human right to walk away. You have a supreme obligation to sever the infected branch before the rot consumes the rest of the tree. My parents and my sister demanded that I finance their vanity. They demanded that I sacrifice my son's stability to maintain their shallow, pathetic illusion of superiority. They believed that the title of family functioned as an absolute shield against accountability. When I refused, they tried to burn my life to the ground. They expected me to remain the obedient scapegoat, the convenient stepping stone they could crush under their designer shoes. But the moment I stopped seeking their validation, the moment I recognized their cruelty, for exactly what it was, their power over me evaporated. I did not owe my abusers a bailout. I did not owe my manipulators my hard-earned success. And I absolutely refused to grant toxic people continued access to my child. I chose my peace. I chose my son. I let the steel trap of their own terrible choices close around them, and I walked away from the wreckage without a single ounce of regret. They are currently living in the prison of their own making, surrounded by the ashes of their arrogance, while I stand in the light of a future I built with my own two hands. I broke the cycle, I severed the bloodline, and in doing so, I finally set us free. We all have difficult choices to make when it comes to the people we are told we must love. It requires an immense, terrifying amount of courage to look at your own family and decide that you deserve better. It takes profound strength to draw a hard line and step into the unknown. But the peace you find on the other side is worth every single moment of that struggle. Have you ever had to walk away from family to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. The profound lesson here is that shared DNA does not obligate you to endure abuse. Society conditions us to believe family loyalty demands endless forgiveness, even at the expense of our well-being. However, true strength lies in recognizing when a toxic environment threatens your peace. Severing ties with manipulative relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You possess the absolute right to build a sanctuary completely free from conditional love and guilt. Take back your power and start establishing healthy boundaries to protect your energy today. Share your own experiences with setting family boundaries in the comments below.